Midlands too, it could be on the heavy side, but as I mentioned, plenty of sunny spells to come. Winds a little lighter than recent days too, so it should just feel a bit warmer compared to of late. Highs around 23 to 24 towards the southeast. Elsewhere, generally the high teens to low 20s. Through the evening time, some cloud and thicker rain pushes into parts of Northern Ireland, perhaps stretching into Wales, and then later on pushing into southern Scotland and northern England, but it tends to be on the light side. Elsewhere, generally dry with some clear spells. Then towards the end of the night, the winds start to pick up and the rain moves into the far southwest. Temperatures for most holding up in double figures, perhaps 14 or 15 as a low across the far south. So it starts to turn wet and windy across southwest England into Wales quite quickly on Friday morning. This band of rain slowly then pushes north and eastwards through the day. Brighter further north and east, but even here clouding over, the risk of some showery rain at times. The wind's starting to pick up towards western coasts. The rain could be heavy at times as well, leading to some local disruption. Temperatures ahead of the rain around 23 or 24, but feeling quite cool, particularly in the west.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Monday to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Hi, I'm Dan Wootton. You can watch me live on GB News Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. And did you know that you can also watch and listen live on our website, gbnews.com. You'll always be up to date on the latest breaking news, as well as enjoying the best stories, opinions and shows. You can even join the debate under our live player as you're watching. So head straight to gbnews.com on TV, radio and online. GB News, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Unhealthy times as NHS waiting lists hit another record high. Junior doctors walk out for an unprecedented 5 days. But is the government about to relent on public pay deals to end the strikes?
BBC Director General Tim Davie is summoned to answer questions in Parliament about the corporation's leadership following the Hugh Edwards allegations. Just how damaged is the broadcaster now?
The Battle of Scampton resumes in the High Court as the local council challenges the Home Office over plans to house 2,000 people at the former RAF Dambusters base. We're live from the hearing.
Plus, Oscar-winning actor Kevin Spacey is in the witness box, telling a jury that he's a big flirt and was somewhat intimate with one of his alleged victims. He denies 12 sex offences against 4 men. We'll have the latest from Southwark Crown Court. Now, though, the latest headlines with Rhiannon.
Thank you, Pip. Good afternoon. It's 1 minute past 12. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. Junior doctors in England have begun their 5-day strike in what's being described as the longest in the history of the NHS. Members of the British Medical Association are walking out in a dispute over pay, arguing for a rise of around 35%. BMA leaders are urging the government to negotiate in a bid to resolve the row, which has already led to thousands of cancelled operations and consultations. Speaking to GB News, Dr Basha Mukherjee says the money is there to pay staff.
As a result of this strike action, they're having to pay £200 an hour to the consultants to cover our shifts effectively. And you're telling me that they can't pay us a 35% rise, which is, for me, is just going to be £25 an hour, which is a massive drop from £200 an hour, which they're taking just to cover the consultant fees to do by not a consultant's job, a junior doctor.
A junior doctor.
Well, as junior doctors begin their strike, the government's finalising a decision on public sector pay. Independent review bodies have reportedly recommended a pay rise of around 6 to 6.5%. Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt this morning held talks over approving the recommendations. The Chancellor says the government will take difficult but responsible decisions on pay awards, while Deputy Labour leader Angela Rayner claims it's refusing to get round the table.
You've got to have a government that's willing to get around the table and negotiate, but also a government that is in the field, in the action and doing the job properly, so that every pound that we have is spent effectively and efficiently. And at the moment, we're not seeing that. The Sun says it has a dossier containing serious and wide-ranging allegations against Hugh Edwards, but it has no plans to publish them. It comes as questions are raised regarding the newspaper's conduct as well as the BBC's response to the allegations. The corporation's Director General will be questioned in Parliament next week on how they were handled. The Met Police has found no evidence of criminality. Former BBC executive Roger Bolton told GB News the corporation's obliged to scrutinise the allegations.
We've got to be very careful about this, of course, because Hugh Edwards can't reply to this. And when it comes to sort of, how can I put this, sexual politics, there's a vast difference between ageing older people, like me, for example, whatever, and young women in particular, say in their 20s, have very different views about what constitutes uncomfortable things. But I just think that in this instance, give the information to the BBC, let them report. Now let us scrutinize. The BBC has absolute obligation to come public.
Virgin Media is under investigation after customers complained of difficulties cancelling their contracts. Customers say when contacting the company to cancel their service, they struggled to speak to an agent or were placed on hold for a long time before their call dropped out. Media watchdog Ofcom says it's concerned about the number of complaints it's received regarding the telecoms company. A major house building company is warning of a drop in the number of new homes being built. Barratt Developments is forecasting its build completions to tumble by as much as 23%. The company says demand dropped following last year's mini-budget as the cost of living crisis and rising mortgage rates impacted household budgets. First home buyers have been hit hardest, plunging 49% after the Help to Buy scheme came to an end.
And the UK economy shrank in May, in part because of the extra bank holiday for the King's coronation. Figures from the Office for National Statistics found GDP declined by 0.1% for the month, following growth of 0.2% in April. The economy had been boosted in the previous month as people spent more in pubs, bars and shops. Chancellor Jeremy Hunt says the best way to get growth going again is to bring inflation down as quickly as possible. And footballer Dele Alli has revealed he was sexually abused when he was 6 years old and was dealing drugs by the time he was 8. Speaking to Gary Neville on his podcast, The Overlap, the Everton midfielder says he recently spent 6 weeks in rehab because of a sleeping pill addiction and mental health issues. He's also revealed he smoked at 7 and was sent to Africa to learn discipline. And he says his adoptive parents have helped him turn his life around.
Yeah, 12 I was adopted, so. And from then, it was like, I was adopted by an amazing family, like I said. I couldn't have asked for better people to do what they've done for me if God created people, it was them.
This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens now, though. It's back over to Mark and Pip.
Hello, you're watching The Live Desk with Mark Longhurst and Pip Thompson. Could the government be about to give all public sector workers a pay increase to stave off further strike action?
Well, it would come as junior doctors begin their unprecedented 5-day walkout, and the NHS waiting list hitting another record high, 7.47 million people now. But suggestions that the government may relent on its hardline approach over public sector pay deals. Let's get more with our political reporter, Catherine Forster, who's in Downing Street. With Catherine, the suggestion that these pay review bodies have been looking at figures of up to 6.5%.
Yes, that's right. In the last few minutes, it is being reported that Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt have decided to accept all the pay review bodies' recommendations for public sector pay. There had been a lot of dispute about this in the last couple of weeks. They spent last year always saying, well, we can't give more because we can only give what the pay review bodies recommend. And then when we heard that the pay review bodies were recommending 6 to 6.5%, we then heard lots of noises along the lines of, actually, we don't know if we can afford this, we might not go along with it. But as you say, 5 days of junior doctors' strikes has just kicked off today. That's absolutely unprecedented. The Prime Minister will be giving a press conference at 1:45. We'll lay out the detail. But what we're hearing is that teachers are going to get 6.5%, junior doctors 6%. Of course, that's a long way short of what they're asking. Police 6%, prison officers 6%, and the armed forces 5 to 6%. But there is a huge caveat to this, because what is expected is that the government are going to say, we'll award these pay rises, but the individual departments will have to find that money out of existing budgets. So that is likely to mean cuts for hospitals, cuts in terms of staffing, resources for schools, if they've got the same pot of money as before, but they're then going to have to find these 6 to 6.5% pay rises. Yeah. No easy answers, of course. The government is in a difficult economic position.
And that is key, because, of course, a lot of the doctors on the picket lines today and for the next few days say it's not just about pay, it's about the NHS in total. So the news that there'll have to be cuts elsewhere to, finance their pay deal may not go down well.
No, it certainly won't. And we've been hearing about splits in Cabinet, people like Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary, really pushing for these recommendations to be accepted. The 6.5% for teachers might possibly be enough to put an end to those strikes. But the junior doctors, another matter altogether. Firstly, because it's way short of the 36%. But as you say, if it's going to come out of existing budgets, that is a real concern for many of the unions, many public sector workers, indeed the education workers too, the teachers too. They don't want this money coming out of existing budgets, but it sounds like that is what is going to happen. We'll know more in about 40 minutes from now.
And it doesn't seem that likely, does it, Catherine, that junior doctors would accept 6% because it is way off the 35% that they are demanding?
Well, it doesn't, but then again, of course, the nurses originally asked for about 17 or 18%, didn't they? And they did eventually settle for something around 5%. Now, OK, one of the unions held out for a long time, but eventually they took a lot less. But really, apart from maybe a few people in the BMA, I don't think there's many people around the country that would think that there's any chance of doctors being given 36%. OK, their pay in real terms has been eroded, along with lots of public sector workers, over the last decade or so, but not by an amount as big as that. I think the IFS reckon that teachers, doctors, etc., have had their pay eroded by between 10 and 20% over the last 13 years or so.
OK, just remind us again, news conference there in Downing Street, we think, Catherine?
1:45.
OK, back to you for that with all the latest. Thank you very much indeed. But to talk about the doctors in more detail now, the health service bosses saying they're sick to the back teeth with the strikes, with the unprecedented 5-day walkout starting today, of course.
The British Medical Association is continuing to demand, as we were just saying, that 35% pay rise to end the dispute, something the government has said is unreasonable because it would further fuel inflation.
But as we've just heard, suggestions now the government may relent on its hardline stance so far on those public service pay deals and maybe recommend or accept the recommendation, indeed, for the doctors, junior doctors, at least of 6%. Let's get more from Birmingham now, because our West Midlands reporter Jack Carson's been speaking to those doctors on the picket line earlier. Jack, as we were reflecting, a huge gulf between the two figures, but a reflection maybe that the doctors just wanted the government to come to them with some kind of deal.
Yeah, there have been negotiations for the last few months between Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, the NHS and the British Medical Association about negotiating some kind of pay deal, of course, for them. The BMA say that over the last 15 years there's been a real term pay cut, and that's why they're asking for this 35% pay increase to take junior doctors' pay back to levels that they last saw in 2008. But with the calling of this industrial action and this historic 5 days of a walkout from around 47,500 medics who are walking out of caring and treating for people in A&E wards, in cancer wards, the government have said that basically stopped the negotiations, and they weren't going to negotiate with the British Medical Association, the union who are of course in dispute with the NHS, while these strikes were on. But the BMA saying, well, in Scotland we were on industrial action and we were still negotiating around a pay offer. A 17.8% pay offer in Scotland has been put to junior doctors there, and they are set to vote on it. But earlier on at this picket line, which only ran till around 10 a.m. this morning, I spoke to Dr. Shivan Sharma, who works for the University Birmingham Hospitals Trust, and he says that what they're asking for is pay restoration.
Pay is the main issue. So doctors, after 5 to 6 years of medical school, we graduate with about £100,000 worth of student debt. And then you start on a salary of £14 an hour. And that too, you have to pay for your own exams, your own courses, your own presentations, your own publications. And all we're asking for is full pay restoration. That's a mere £5 to £10 increase in the average salary of doctors. So instead of a doctor being paid £14 an hour, they'll be paid £19 an hour. And if you ask any of the member of the general public, if they're in hospital at 7 p.m. on a Friday night, do they think it's reasonable for their doctor to be paid £19 an hour? And I think the resounding answer you'd get is yes.
Just explain to us, Jack, why there aren't still people on the picket line now. I mean, there are some suggestions that they've been advised by their unions to do a couple of hours and then go for a picnic.
Yeah, that is what has been seen on the advice and the guidance from the British Medical Association for their picket line workers. So they're on a picket line today from 8 a.m. till 10 a.m. They'll be on a picket line again for the same time, but over the weekend and on Monday, the junior doctors here will not be on a picket line. As you mentioned, the British Medical Association have said that they should take a chance to recuperate, and they've given guidance on these striking workers to possibly go for a picnic, as you mentioned, watch TV, read a book, other things other than go out on a picket line, which of course is the traditional way, as we saw from the amount of nurse strikes, of how they physically showed their support for this action.
OK, it's a new approach. Thank you very much, Jack, for bringing us the latest there from Birmingham. Now, the former chairman of the BMA-GP's committee, Dr Lawrence Buckman, joins us now. Dr Buckman, good to see you on GB News this afternoon. Give us your initial reaction then to what we think could be this offer from the government for a 6.5% pay rise.
Well, it would be quite nice if it was new money, then we could talk about whether it was enough. But since it's actually being taken out of the NHS pot, it's not actually going to be new to anybody, and all it will do is deprive patients and other colleagues of what they're entitled to. So other staff will not get pay also without coming out of the same budget, and patient services will be cut to pay for the staff pay. And that's really not the way to run a pay rise. Then we could debate whether it's enough or not, and I think that really depends on proper, effective negotiations with both sides coming to the table and talking about the deal, which is much more than just the money.
Yeah, and certainly the reporters who've spoken to the doctors and the picket lines so far today, particularly Press Association, saying a lot of the doctors are talking about the erosion of the NHS as the main issue, not just the specific pay deal.
Well, unfortunately, the NHS is falling apart. Physically, the buildings are falling apart. Behaviourally, a lot of doctors and nurses and other colleagues are falling apart themselves. They can't deliver the service because they look at what they're being forced to provide and they don't like it. And I don't blame patients for feeling they're getting shortchanged, which they are.
But there are NHS bosses saying this has got to be solved by the end of the summer because we have to make these waiting list targets, and we're simply not going to reduce that waiting list. I mean, they're at a new high today, aren't they? They've gone upwards again to about 7.7 million.
Yes, waiting lists are a measure of how badly the NHS is doing, and the answer is very badly. Whether the juniors go on strike or not, the service will still struggle to deliver to patients who rightly need whatever treatment they need. They shouldn't be on the end of a waiting list. But the amount of patients that we put on the waiting list purely as a consequence of the strike is fairly small compared to the overall number of people who are waiting and will go on waiting even if there was no strike. Striking is never the best way of solving a problem. Both sides are going to have to talk eventually, so they might as well start talking now about the NHS more generally and about pay in particular.
And on that specific issue of communication, I mean, it does seem that the doctors have been very frustrated with the fact that the health secretary is saying, you know, you've got to suspend the strike action before we even consider getting around the table. How much trust has been lost between the two sides?
Well, there's public trust and private trust. Those of us who've been in negotiations for years can tell you that whatever goes on in public, privately, you have to keep channels open in order to communicate between both sides. Even if you don't agree, you still have to communicate. If communications really are broken off, then I think it's very difficult to see how any solution which would satisfy anybody, Treasury, Department of Health, or the British public, or doctors, can ever be arrived at if you can't talk to the other side. Both sides want the thing to work. Yeah. It's in nobody's interest to have strikes are never in anybody's interest, not the doctors and not the patients, and probably not the government either. But waiting lists will inevitably rise unless you talk around the table. First, you better talk in private, and then you need to start talking in the public view. And none of that's happening for some reason.
Yeah, and of course, we've got the additional thing as well as the junior doctors, or the consultants this time round as well, which is adding yet another tier, if you like, to the problem, and I guess additional costs as well.
Yes, consultants are utterly fed up with the way the health service is going, and they are having to shore it up. They feel they're doing it with goodwill. In other words, they're not getting paid for it. And no doubt, whatever pay they get will also be taken off the NHS budget. So in other words, it will get even worse. So I understand why consultants and juniors are taking the decisions they're taking. I think it's very unfortunate that they and the government cannot sit in the same room and try and come together with a deal, which won't just be about money. Some of this is about money. An awful lot of it is about the way the health service works.
Right, but has there been a way forward indicated by the long-term staffing agreement that we had and the indication of this, what, $2.5 billion over the next 5 years?
Not really, because money, this isn't about money. Money's not going to buy you more doctors. However you do it, we don't have enough. We have to come to a really good, very short-term solution for dealing with the waiting list, plus all those people who are in pain and suffering with other things from which they're not going to die, but they're still suffering badly. Every orthopedic case is suffering. None of those people should be waiting. And you can't solve that by saying, well, in 10 years' time, we'll have more doctors. Well, that's terrific, and that will be good in 10 years' time. But what are we going to do for the next 10 years? You have to have short, medium, and long-term solutions. And the government's idea of just putting money into it, always welcome, that won't solve anything on its own. You have to have credible solutions, not a finger in the air and, oh, I think this will work. Well, it won't. They have to start talking and planning together. And that seems to be something that this government lacks. And the BMA is very frustrated, I know. And I wish they could get together rather than shout at each other.
Dr. Lawrence Buckman, former chairman, of course, of the BMA GPs Committee, thanks very much indeed for bringing us your reaction. And we'll see what the Prime Minister, of course, brings that, 20 to 1, we're thinking that maybe in Downing Street.
Do stay with us here on GB News. We will be talking about the Battle of Scampton. We are at the High Court, where a local council is trying to stop the government housing asylum seekers in a former RAF base. The latest, very shortly. Stay with us.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
I'm Alex Deakin. This is your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. Sunny spells and more showers today, although not as many and not as heavy the showers as there have been over recent days, and the breeze is at least a little bit lighter. Don't get used to that, however, because two areas of low pressure are merging to bring us a wet and windy spell through Friday and the weekend. But back to this afternoon, it's not completely dry. Some heavy showers still possible across parts of Scotland and later on across East Anglia. One or two lighter showers elsewhere, but actually for a good part of the country it is going to be dry, and at times we'll see a bit of blue sky, the sun will pop out and temperatures will get to around about average for the time of year, high teens across the north, low 20s further south, but feeling a little warmer than yesterday because the winds are a touch lighter. As I said, though, that isn't going to last. The breeze picks up, rain comes into Northern Ireland, across parts of Wales during this evening, spreading to northwest England. But the really wet and windy weather comes into the far southwest later in the night. The wind's really picking up here and some heavy bursts of rain. Temperatures mostly holding up in the teens. On to Friday then, and it is a dry, perhaps bright start over central and eastern England. Northern Scotland may stay dry for most of the day, but one area of rain pushes north, and then this wet and windy weather sweeps in across the southwest Wales, into parts of the Midlands, across southern England and Northern Ireland come the afternoon. That wet and windy weather will last into the weekend for most of us as well. Temperatures again, high teens for most and feeling cooler with the wind and rain.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the live desk. Now, legal moves to prevent 2,000 asylum seekers being housed at RAF Scampton, the famed base, of course, of the dam busters, have resumed at the High Court today.
The hearing is to determine whether the case can proceed to a full judicial review, potentially halting the Home Office's plans for the former base in Lincolnshire. Today, the judge is hearing submissions from the council as well as a local resident.
Let's get the latest now from outside the Royal Courts of Justice with our political reporter Olivia Utley. And of course, Olivia, we had proceedings underway yesterday concerning another base. There's a lot for the judge to consider here before it even goes through to any sort of full legal process, rather.
Well, there absolutely is. As you said, this is the very first stage in West Lindsey District Council's plan to proceed to a full judicial review against the Home Office's plans to house 2,000 illegal migrants, mostly men, in the RAF Scampton base. And as you mentioned there is another case going on at the same time, Braintree Council, who are arguing against the government's decision to house 1,700 migrants at RAF Wethersfield base. Richard Wald KC, who's speaking on behalf of West Lindsey District Council, has been up in court today. Again, it's a very full court. Yesterday they had to move to a bigger court. There was so much interest in the case, and today the court is completely full, no more admittance. Richard Wald KC is arguing 2 points. One is that there is a regeneration project planned for RAF Scampton. £300 million is planning to be invested in tourism and heritage. And he says that if these government proposals go ahead and 2,000 male illegal migrants are allowed to wander the area, come and go as they please with RAF Scampton as their base, investors for that £300 million project will start to pull out. And they say, the West Lindsey District Council, that the Scampton area is in desperate need of regeneration. And if the government goes ahead, that regeneration will be impossible. The other point that Richard Wald has been making, and it's garnered a lot of interest, a lot of anger really in the court today, is that Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, he claims, isn't being candid about how long she plans to house migrants there. Now, residents say that she only has permission, she only has the right to hold them there for 12 months. That's if if the government does win its judicial review, she can hold them there for 12 months. But when she speaks in Parliament, she suggests that she would be holding them there for 3 years to 5 years. Now, if that were the case, then obviously those regeneration projects that I mentioned would be severely under threat, and it does seem quite likely that investors would walk away. It is a huge problem for the government because every time Suella Braverman comes up with a bright new idea of where to house these illegal migrants who are still coming in their boatloads pretty much every day from the continent, every time she comes up with a new idea, wherever the base is going to be, the local council or the local MP, and in some cases it is a Conservative MP, says, well, all very well, I understand you need to house these migrants, but not in my backyard. The threat to the local community or the change in life to the local community would be too great. So if the government loses both of these cases that are in the High Court at the moment, both Braintree and West Lindsey District Council, then it becomes more and more difficult for them to find a place to house those migrants. And of course we know that the waiting time for migrants while they're awaiting their case to decide whether they could stay in the country is now over a year long. So migrants are staying here, they're still coming in, and they're just simply piling up, really. There's a bottleneck which the government really needs to break.
Olivia Utley, outside the Royal Courts of Justice, thank you. Just giving you a quick bit of an update on our top story about that pay offer for public sector workers. We are just hearing now that in the House of Commons, it has been announced that public sector workers will get a pay rise of 6% or more. We are expecting a press conference from the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, in the next few minutes on that. But that is just what has been announced in the House of Commons.
Yeah, let's just bring you through a few details. Treasury Minister John Glenn saying new teachers will start on at least £30,000. Police to get a 7% pay rise. That's just coming through. Whereas junior doctors, of course, they're on strike at the moment, will get a 6% pay uplift, as he described it. More reaction, of course, coming through on that. But let's get an update on all the news headlines now with Rhiannon.
Thank you, Mark. It's just gone 12:31. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. And as we've been hearing, the government has accepted a pay rise of 6% for public sector workers. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's accepted the recommendations from all the pay review bodies on public sector pay. The Chancellor has suggested any pay increase will come from budget cuts rather than borrowing, and we'll bring you more on that as we get it. Junior doctors in England, meanwhile, have begun their 5-day strike in what's being described as the longest in the history of the NHS. Members of the British Medical Association are walking out in a dispute over pay, arguing for a rise of around 35%. BMA leaders are urging the government to negotiate in a bid to resolve the row, which has already led to thousands of cancelled operations and consultations. The Sun says it has a dossier containing serious and wide-ranging allegations against Hugh Edwards, but it has no plans to publish them. It comes as questions are raised regarding the paper's conduct, with a former editor accusing it of inflicting terror on the presenter. Meanwhile, the BBC's Director General will be questioned in Parliament next week regarding the corporation's handling of the allegations. The Met Police has found no evidence of criminality. Virgin Media is under investigation after customers complained of difficulties cancelling their contracts. Customers say when contacting the company to cancel their service, they struggled to speak with an agent or were placed on hold for a long time before their call finally dropped out. Media watchdog Ofcom says it's concerned about the number of complaints it's received regarding the telecoms company. And a major house building company is warning of a drop in the number of new homes being built. Barratt Developments is forecasting its build completions to tumble by as much as 23%. The company says demand dropped following last year's mini-budget as the cost of living crisis and rising mortgage rates impacted household budgets. You can get more on all of those stories by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
I'm Alex Deakin. This is your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. Sunny spells and more showers today, although not as many and not as heavy the showers as they have been over recent days, and the breeze is at least a little bit lighter. Don't get used to that, however, because two areas of low pressure are merging to bring us a wet and windy spell through Friday and the weekend. But back to this afternoon, it's not completely dry. Some heavy showers still possible across parts of Scotland and later on across East Anglia. One or two lighter showers elsewhere, but actually for a good part of the country it is going to be dry, and at times we'll see a bit of blue sky, the sun will pop out and temperatures will get to around about average for the time of year, high teens across the north, low 20s further south, but feeling a little warmer than yesterday because the winds are a touch lighter. As I said, though, that isn't going to last. The breeze picks up, rain comes into Northern Ireland, across parts of Wales during this evening, spreading to northwest England. But the really wet and windy weather comes into the far southwest later in the night. The wind's really picking up here and some heavy bursts of rain. Temperatures mostly holding up in the teens. On to Friday then, and it is a dry, perhaps bright start over central and eastern England. Northern Scotland may stay dry for most of the day, but one area of rain pushes north, and then this wet and windy weather sweeps in across the southwest Wales, into parts of the Midlands, across southern England and Northern Ireland come the afternoon. That wet and windy weather will last into the weekend for most of us as well. Temperatures again, high teens for most, and feeling cooler with the wind and rain.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views, and often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is two new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard. We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often there will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB.
Welcome back to the Live Desk. The breaking news is that the government is to accept the recommendations of the independent pay review bodies on public service pay for millions of public sector workers. The headlines we're getting from John Glenn, the Treasury Minister, on his feet in the Commons at the moment, is that junior doctors will get 6% plus £1,250 consolidated payment. Of course, they are striking today. That's Pat McFadden on the other side of the dispatch box replying. And an increase, we're being told, with no new borrowing or spending.
Police will get a 7% pay rise, armed forces 5% pay rise. He is stressing, John Glenn, the Treasury Minister, that the government is being fiscally responsible and it is a fair deal. But of course we know that junior doctors have gone on strike today for the first of 5 days and they want 35%. This pay increase is 6%, so way off what they are wanting.
Questions and no doubt Pat McFadden trying to press him on this over how the increase is to be funded, because the government, as we say, ruling out extra borrowing, so it may have to come from existing budgets, something that would be very unwelcome for those doctors in terms of the NHS. However, John Glenn has indicated that the increased cost of work and visitor visas will be used to pay for the rises, but we're not quite sure how much that would raise. But clearly, this news conference we're expecting with the Prime Minister at about 20 to 1 onwards now, so any time now in Downing Street, we may get further indications as to how the money will be raised. So, breaking news there that the pay deal for public sector workers, advised by the independent pay review bodies, accepted effectively by the government.
Now, let's move on to the ongoing story about the BBC. Its Director General, Tim Davie, has been called before a House of Lords committee along with the corporation's chair to answer questions on its handling of the Hugh Edwards allegations. In the last few moments, the mental health charity Mind has called for Hugh Edwards to be given the space to receive treatment.
Indeed, Hugh Edwards is mentor to the Mind charity in Llanelli, which is the town where he was educated and brought up, but indications too that the Director General, the acting chair of the BBC and indeed the head of policy will all be called before a House of Lords committee next week to answer for their handling of the various allegations. Well, let's get more now with Mark White, who's outside broadcast or new broadcasting house for us once more. And Mark, an indication that now we're getting a bit of reaction from these mental health charities, for instance, on what are changed circumstances.
Yes, I mean, there's no doubt, of course, that there is concern over the condition of Hugh Edwards following the revelation from his wife that he, we know, had suffered from severe depression for a number of years and had had a very serious episode in light of the allegations that were made against him. But that concern aside, there are clearly still questions for Hugh Edwards to answer. OK, the Metropolitan Police have decided that the initial allegation that was splashed in The Sun last Friday does not amount, in their opinion, at this stage to any criminal conduct, but that doesn't mean that it's not conduct that might be seen as inappropriate or grossly inappropriate by the BBC senior management when they carry out their internal investigation. And remember now, since that initial allegation, there are a slew of other allegations. The BBC's own news division, Newsnight, last night, reporting on a number of staff past and present who have alleged inappropriate contact with this star presenter. So yes, of course, some real concern about his health condition, but that doesn't mean that there aren't questions and an investigation that needs to run its course within now the BBC.
And also questions for the Sun newspaper, Mark, because of how it has handled the allegations that were made, the stories that it ran, with or without claims from, with or without a denial from the young person involved. The Sun, some are saying, is on very dodgy ground.
Well, it may well be. I mean, sadly, and perhaps predictably this issue is descending a bit towards factional fighting among some, those who are very critical of the Sun and the Murdoch empire, and those, of course, who are very critical of the BBC, and the truth may lie somewhere in between. And I think you're right, there are certainly some questions that the Sun do need to respond to. For instance, given that the young person at the centre of those initial allegations made by a family member to the BBC on the 18th of May, not really acted upon with any great urgency by the corporation, and the parents then going to the Sun and them splashing that story, given the fact that the young person at the centre of those allegations had issued a statement, had contacted the Sun actually to say that the allegations were wrong. Why was that not included in the original reporting by the Sun? That's one clear question I think that they have got to respond to.
We're going to break away, Mark, because we got the Prime Minister on his feet, Rishi Sunak, about to give more details on the public sector pay deals.
But also fair to taxpayers, who ultimately fund our public services. And the best way we found of making fair decisions about public sector pay are the independent pay review bodies. They were called for by the unions themselves, and for over 4 decades, they have been the independent arbiters of what is fair and responsible. Those bodies have considered a range of evidence about where to set this year's pay, and their recommendations to government are for public sector pay rises to go up by a significant amount. Now, clearly this will cost all of you, as taxpayers, more than we had budgeted for. That's why the decision has been difficult and why it has taken time to decide the right course of action. I can confirm today that we are accepting the headline recommendations of the pay review bodies in full. But we will not fund them by borrowing more or increasing your taxes. It would not be right to increase taxes on everyone to pay some people more, particularly when household budgets are so tight. Neither would it be right to pay for them by higher borrowing, because higher borrowing simply makes inflation worse. Instead, because we only have a fixed pot of money to spend from, that means government departments have had to find savings and efficiencies elsewhere in order to prioritise paying public sector workers more. Now, there's a clear message here. There are always choices. Budgets are not infinite. When some ask for higher pay, that will always create pressures elsewhere, costs, which must ultimately be borne by the taxpayer or by spending less on our other priorities. So that's our decision. And having honoured the independent pay review process, I urge all union leaders to accept these pay offers and call off their strikes. Already, earlier this year, the NHS Staff Council, representing over half a dozen unions and over 1 million NHS workers, made a significant decision and voted to accept our pay offer and suspend strikes. I'm grateful to them and their members. And today, in response to the news of our decision, I'm pleased to say we've had another major breakthrough. All teaching unions have just announced that they're suspending all planned strikes immediately. Teachers will return to the classroom. Disruption to our children's education will end. And the unions have themselves confirmed that this pay offer is properly funded. And so they're recommending to their members an end to the entire dispute. So it is now clear, momentum across our public services is shifting. The vast majority who just want to get on with their life's calling of serving others are now returning to work. And in that spirit, I want to address those yet to do so. Now that we've honoured the independent pay recommendations, I implore you, do the right thing and know when to say yes. In particular, for doctors and consultants, I would say this. We have a national mission for all of us to make the NHS strong again. The government has not only made today's decision on pay, we've backed the NHS with record funding, delivered the first ever fully funded long-term workforce plan, and met the BMA's #1 ask of government with a pensions tax cut worth £1 billion. So we should all ask ourselves, whether union leaders or indeed political leaders, how can it be right to continue disruptive industrial action? Not least because these strikes lead to tens of thousands of appointments being cancelled every single day, and waiting lists going up, not down. So, today's offer is final. There will be no more talks on pay. We will not negotiate again on this year's settlements, and no amount of strikes will change our decision. Instead, the settlement we've reached today gives us a fair way to end the strikes, a fair deal for workers, and a fair deal for the British taxpayer. Thank you. We'll take some questions from the media. Can I start with the BBC, please?
Thank you, Prime Minister. Chris Spacey, BBC News. Will you acknowledge explicitly that a consequence of your decision will mean cuts in the budgets of some key public services, and explicitly on schools, given what you've just said about schools, where is the money coming from to pay for that? Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So, as I said in my speech, this is a significant pay award. It's one of the most significant we've had in decades, and it is costing billions of pounds more than the government had budgeted for, and that has consequences. If we're going to prioritise paying public sector workers more, that money has to come from somewhere else, because I'm not prepared to put up people's taxes, and I don't think it would be responsible or right to borrow more, because that would just make inflation worse. So what we have done are two things to find this money. The first is we're going to increase the charges that we have for migrants who are coming to this country when they apply for visas, and indeed something called the Immigration Health Surcharge, which is the levy that they pay to access the NHS. So all of those fees are going to go up, and that will raise over £1 billion. So across the board, visa application fees are going to go up significantly, and similarly for the Immigration Health Surcharge, for migrants who are coming to this country legally, they have to pay a fee to access the NHS, to contribute to NHS care. I think that's entirely right. Neither of these fees have been increased recently, and we think it's appropriate, given the costs for everything have gone up, that those fees, both for applying for visas and for accessing the NHS, go up too. That will raise over £1 billion, as I said, so it's a significant contribution to helping us pay for these pay awards. But also, we are reprioritising. So we are asking governments, departments to reprioritise to support public sector workers, and that will mean in other areas we will be, it's not about cuts, it's just about focusing on public sector workers' pay rather than other things. And I'm really pleased that the teaching unions specifically have said that they believe this pay offer is properly funded. We put more money into the teaching budget when I first became Prime Minister, £2 billion a year, and there will be more money going into the schools budget to help schools pay for these new pay awards. So they will not have to make cuts, and that was something that was rightly important to the unions, and we have worked with them to ensure that the funding is there for schools so that no cuts will need to be made. The pay offer is properly funded, and that's the basis on which the unions have called off their action, and I'm grateful to them and their members for that. Perfect. Next, can I go to the ITV?
Prime Minister, NHS leaders say there is no chance of them being able to reduce backlogs on treatments in the way that you want if they have to make savings. Are they going to have to make savings to fund part of this pay rise? And then separately, the Office for Budget Responsibility today has said that the UK's government debt is much more vulnerable to rising inflation than any other G7 leading country. Part of the reason is because of decisions you took as Chancellor on QE and on issuing index-linked gilts. Do you regret those decisions?
So on your second question, Robert, it's something you and I discussed a lot when I was Chancellor. Actually, you'll know we have one of the longest durations of government borrowing out of any G7 country and have consistently reduced the amount of inflation-linked debt over years. That's been a downward trend. It's something that I pointed out as a risk to the public finances when I was Chancellor. And that's why I talked then about the risk to the country's public finances and economic security from rising inflation and interest rates. That's why my first priority is to halve inflation, because that is not only good for families' budgets, eases cost of living pressures, it will over time bring down interest rates, which is also good for government borrowing and the strength of the public finances. So you're right to highlight the risks of inflation and interest rates on the public finances. I highlighted the same risk as Chancellor, and that's why an important part of today's decision is, yes, we are accepting the recommendations of the pay review bodies, but we're doing so without borrowing more, because I don't think that would be responsible for all the reasons you outlined, and without taxing people more. Now, with regard to the backlogs in the NHS, look, I agree. Industrial action, strikes, make it far harder for us to cut the backlogs. Right? We've already had 500,000 people's outpatient appointments cancelled and disrupted by the strike action that we've seen to date. It's an enormous number. And in spite of that, though, because of all the other things we're doing with the funding we're putting into the NHS, thanks to lots of people's hard work and creativity, we are making progress. So last year we eliminated practically the number of people waiting 2 years for treatment. This spring, we're practically eliminating the number of people waiting 1.5 years, and that's come down to just a few thousand now from over 100,000 at its peak. And we have plans in place to continue working on backlogs. But without the industrial action ending, of course, that will be more difficult. And that's why I would urge consultants and junior doctors to accept the recommendations of the independent pay review body. This is not even the government. This is the independent pay review body who has made a recommendation on their pay, which we have accepted in full, on top of all the other things we've done for the NHS, like the long-term workforce plan just the other week, something that has been called for decades, we have delivered. I would urge them to accept this offer from the independent bodies, and that way we can all work collectively together to bring the backlogs down. I know that that's what the vast majority of them want to see happen. That's what I want to see happen, and I'm prepared to work with them to do that.
But will the NHS have to make savings?
As I said, one of the ways that we're raising money to pay for this is through the immigration health surcharge. That is money that goes to the NHS. So when people emigrate to this country, they have to pay something called the immigration health surcharge to contribute to the cost of the NHS, and the cost of that will go up as part of this announcement in order to raise more money for the NHS to help pay for some of these costs. And could I go next to Talk Radio?
Hello, Peter Cardwell, Talk Radio. Are you slightly hiding behind the independent pay review bodies here? The junior doctors are getting less than 1/5 of the percentage point rise that you're asking. How do you honestly expect them to believe that this is a fair offer when they're asking for so much more? And won't strikes be inevitable now in the autumn?
This is a process. The independent pay review bodies are a process that has existed for a very long time. Indeed, it's an institution and a set of institutions that the unions themselves called for, and for a long time it's been accepted as the best fair way that we have in this country to find resolution on public sector pay. Now, there are representatives of unions, of government, of economists on the boards of these public sector pay review bodies. They make independent recommendations to the government, and they do so in a range of sectors. And that's what we've accepted. Right? That's what we've accepted, and we've accepted their headline recommendations in full. For junior doctors in particular, I'd say a typical junior doctor on pay point 3 is going to receive a significant pay increase, around 9%, as a result of us accepting the PRB's recommendation. I think most people think that is a significant pay increase. For a typical junior doctor, 9%. That is the pay increase that is being delivered as a result of our decision today. And that comes along all the other things that we've done for the NHS. Record funding, a long-term workforce plan fully funded so that there are more doctors, more nurses, more of every type of healthcare worker in the NHS for the first ever time. Funded expansion of training places that everyone has called for, and as those junior doctors progress to become consultants and are paid even more, they will benefit from the significant tax cut that the Chancellor announced in the spring budget, which was the BMA's #1 ask of government. Was that pensions tax cut? We've delivered it, and those junior doctors, as their careers progress, will benefit from that. So look, taken together, I think we've done the fair thing. And I would urge the junior doctors and consultants to see that, to see the commitment that we have to the NHS, to recognise the economic context that we're in, and accept the recommendations of the independent pay review body, a process that is long established, is independent of government. We've done what I believe to be the right and responsible thing, and I would urge them to do the same thing too. Can I go to the Daily Mail?
Harriet Line, Daily Mail.
How do you expect to bring down inflation to 5% when you're giving public sector workers a pay rise of in excess of 6%? And secondly, you said earlier this week that you didn't know who the BBC presenter facing serious allegations was. Were you shocked when you heard the news yesterday?
On your first point, Harriet, if you look at current pay settlements across different ranges, lots of different estimates and forecasts for what pay settlements in the private sector are averaging at the moment and are forecast to be. So whether you look at ONS data that was out the other day, Bank of England, Treasury has a panel that they use, expert HR survey data as well, all of that points to private sector pay settlements in the kind of 5 to 7% range now and over the course of the year. And I think the vast majority of these PRB recommendations fit within that type of range. So they are broadly, obviously it's going to vary for each individual person depending on what grade they're in, but broadly in aggregate, the pay settlements from the PRBs are in line with what we're seeing in the private sector. That's the first thing to say. I think the second thing I'd say is, is it inflationary, is it not inflationary? It's not going to be inflationary because we're not borrowing to fund it. And I think, and I've been very clear about this, everyone can see the economic context we're in. I'm determined to bring inflation down, and government has a responsibility not to excessively borrow money. If we do that, we just will make the situation worse and make it last longer. I'm not going to do that, which is why we have had to make some other decisions elsewhere on visa fees, immigration health surcharge, reprioritisation to pay for these pay settlements, because that's what being in government means. It's about prioritising, it's about making choices, doing the difficult and responsible things. That's what we've done, but I am determined to bring inflation down, and this is one of the things that will help us do that because we have not borrowed to fund these pay increases. Next, could I go to the Telegraph?
Hi, Ben Riley-Smith, The Telegraph. Can I just drill into where the money's coming from? Because it's not coming from borrowing. About £1 billion's coming from these visa fees. That leaves a couple of billion, I think, that needs to be found from reprioritisation. Can you name a single thing that's going to be squeezed to get the money through reprioritisation?
Yeah, it's not one big thing, Ben. It will be a range of things. So the Chancellor and I and the Chief Secretary have engaged in an exercise with departments for a while. And I think many of you are asking, when are we going to see this decision on pay? When are we going to see it? It's because we've been taking the time to go through everyone's budgets to make sure that there are areas that where we can find reprioritisations from, where we're maybe not spending as much as we had anticipated, that we can shift over to public sector pay without impacting frontline service delivery, because that was very important to us. It was also important to the schools unions, and that's why they are confident that there is extra money going into the schools budget to make sure that these pay offers are fully funded. So it's not one big thing, it's just painstaking work of going through every department's budget line by line, finding every little bit of saving or where we're not quite spending as much as we thought, where we can shift that to public sector pay to make sure our workers are rewarded and that we honour the recommendations of the pay review bodies. But what I would say is that does mean choices, right? And I'm not shying away from that because I think that's the right thing to do. But because we're raising money through fees and the immigration health surcharge, that contributes significantly and will ease some of that pressure. The Guardian, I think, lastly. We've got time. Yes.
Hi, Pippa Carrera from The Guardian. You talk about reprioritisation of what sounds like it's going to be about £2 billion worth of money. Can you guarantee that that decision won't mean more frontline cuts? Let's just call a spade a spade. And secondly, can I just ask you if you can give us a status update on Liz Truss's resignation peerages? Are we likely to see them over the summer?
On the previous question, it's the same thing. We have protected frontline services. So I think the teaching unions would not have supported this offer if they didn't believe that there was money coming into the core schools budget to help pay for these significant pay awards. So we have worked through the detail of that with them specifically to make sure that they are comfortable in how we're doing this. And as you can see, I very much welcome the engagement we've had with them, the constructive way that they've approached those conversations, and indeed their announcement today, which I think is enormously wonderful news for our children. It's important that we get them back into the classrooms and catching up on what they lost out on COVID. So I'm delighted with today's news. And more broadly, whether it's NHS or everywhere, we've funded the frontline services actually very generously, and we're now going to deliver on improving, as I said, people's waiting times for electives and all the rest of it. I haven't got an update for you on Presidential Honours. They haven't come to me yet, and as I think you know, I tend to just follow the due process on these things. And I also, someone had a question before about BBC. Look, I wasn't, sorry, I just forgot, I wasn't ignoring your question, but I would say, look, I think for all the reasons that everyone is aware of, this is an incredibly sensitive matter. And what I'd say is that the BBC is going through its process of fact-finding and establishing what's happened. The right thing is for them to get on with that, and for us to give them the space to do that and recognise the sensitivity of this for all involved. And there's nothing more than that I can or should say, I think, at this point. Good. I think that's it. We've got one time. Last one. Yeah, times.
You're standing up in front of a pledge to halve inflation, but minister after minister has refused to say what that means, what the actual target will be. Is it 5%? 5.35%, 5.5%. Can you today level with people and just say exactly what that target is, so we know what metric to judge you by?
I think that everyone can see what inflation was when I made that announcement in I made the announcement in January, and we had the numbers I think for December last year. But look, do I think that everyone sitting at home is focusing on whether inflation goes down to 5.2, 5.4, 5.3? No, I don't. Actually, what I think they want to know is that the government is committed to easing the burden on their cost of living. And that is my priority, and halving inflation is the most important step we have to doing that. And I want to do that over the course of this year. Clearly, that's become more challenging. Everyone can see that in the numbers, but that doesn't mean it wasn't the right thing to say. You know, I am ambitious for our country. When I set those targets or priorities, lots of people said, well, that's all going to be too easy. You said all these things that you're going to easily meet. That was what people said. I didn't believe that. I thought it would be tough. But I thought it was the right thing to do, because that's the way that we can bring maximum benefit to people's families up and down the country, and we're going to absolutely stick to the course. That's why today's decision is important. As I said, it wouldn't have been right to accept these pay offers and then fund them with borrowing. That would have been the easy thing for me to do. Wouldn't have involved me having to put fees up everywhere else on visa fees or immigration health surcharge. Wouldn't have involved, detailed work trying to find savings and reprioritisation from elsewhere. Would have been easy, but it would have been wrong. It wouldn't have been the responsible thing to do for the country, because I'm determined to bring inflation down, and I'm confident that we will do so. And halving inflation is just a staging post, because inflation belongs back where it should be at 2%. Right? So, this is a journey to get it down there, but that was the first step on the journey. But people should be left in no doubt about my resolve to deliver on it. Perfect. Thank you very much for your time.
So, the Prime Minister asserting that it's perfect. Well, at least for the teaching unions, it does seem to be. Just to bring you that breaking news that the Prime Minister brought us, all teaching unions have suspended their planned strikes immediately because they believe that this pay deal announced is properly funded. As the Prime Minister said, 6.5% deal, at least £30,000 starting salary now for teachers. But, of course, other figures too for the rest of the public sector.
Yeah, pay rises of at least 6% for everybody, but police 7%. And the Prime Minister did actually give a very stern warning to those trade unions and workers that are still involved in strikes. And he is saying that this new pay offer is final, and that people just need to accept it. There will be no more offers, he says. Let's get the views on this now with GB News business and economics editor Liam Halligan with On the Money. So let's put this into economic context then, Liam. He says that these pay rises are not inflationary because there is no borrowing to fund them.
Yeah, that's roughly what he's saying. I think that's a credible position, as long as various government departments can make the savings to deliver these public sector pay rises. The government is clearly trying to draw a line under months and months and months of public sector strikes. I think it's very significant that he says at least he's got the various teaching unions on board. Junior doctors, other health unions have still to decide what they're going to do. And, of course, we've got other sort of semi-public sector strikes at the Tube in London and national rail services. But I think in general, this is a good day for the government if indeed the trade unions respond to it in a positive way. Let's just have a little look at what's actually happened today. We can see here in a graphic that ministers have accepted. That says ministers considering that. We made that graphic just a few minutes ago. They have now accepted this 6 to 6.5% pay rise. You can see that actually that's lower than the rate of inflation, which is 8.7%. That's going to come in immediately, those public sector pay rises. It's in line with the official pay review bodies, as I've said. It's less than the rate of inflation, which is 8.7%. And I think in general, ministers are trying to really draw a line under the problems that they've been having. And just a little bit more detail here. The police are going to get 7%. Most of the NHS are going to get 5 to 6%, though there are other additional payments, one-off payments. That's why the Prime Minister talks about 9%, because there'll be a one-off annual payment that will only last 1 year. Junior doctors are getting 6, prison officers 7, armed forces, always a little bit less, unfortunately. They're getting 5% and teachers 6.5%.
Yet to get response from the BMA, of course, who are on strike for 5 days.
They wanted 35%.
Yes, there's a big gap.
Doctors.
However, a lot of the reporters there are already doing the rough maths, because the Prime Minister indicated there's £1 billion coming from this idea of an increased levy
visa fees,
for health surcharges for migrants coming into the country, and visa fees going up as well. But their estimate was that this will cost £3 billion. Therefore, where's the extra £2 billion coming from if you're not borrowing or actually taxing more?
These estimates, we're talking about single-digit billions in public spending of hundreds of billions every year. This stuff kind of comes out in the wash. I mean, it's interesting to me politically that Rishi Sunak wants to make a play of the fact that he's not borrowing, to your point, Pip, so no one can say this is inflationary. But also, the extra money he's getting it on visa fees, on so-called NHS tourism, cracking down on that and making people pay for that, touching areas related to borders that he knows the public is really concerned about at the moment in the middle of the small boats crisis. So there's some clever, maybe a bit too clever politics going on there, saying that he's going to pay for this stuff without borrowing. I think that's credible and sound, but also by levying fees on visas and NHS.
He's also saying that it's reasonable because it's broadly in line with private sector increases.
It is broadly in line with private sector increases. 7.3% was the private sector pay rise that we learnt of yesterday between March and May, compared to March to May 2022. We should say also that about a fifth of us work in the public sector, and these pay review bodies cover about half the public sector. We're talking about a half of a fifth, or about 1 in 10 of the population are impacted by these numbers. The vast majority of civil servants, both in Whitehall and across the rest of the UK, this doesn't cover them. They'll have separate agreements.
Yeah, and I'm just looking at the language, because, again, he was pressed by the reporters, savings or cuts. He wanted to talk about reprioritising and indicating that they've already been talking to government departments to identify where maybe there's been an underspend in some parts, and that money can be actually shifted to a different department.
That's right. There will be some pain here. I mean, particularly if the underspend is if the Department for Health is told to reprioritise, where, of course, a lot of these wage bills will fall. Expect leaks from Sir Humphrey and others to journalists like me saying, oh, we're cutting this frontline service, we're cutting that frontline service. So I think the Prime Minister and his team have made a major step towards better industrial relations today, but a lot of it will be in the union's acceptance beyond the teachers, and also in the implementation. So there's lots of landmines he can step on.
And let's not forget, it was only a few days ago that the TUC was being pretty vocal, saying that they were expecting the government to ignore this public sector issue in terms of the independent pay review bodies, and warning how dangerous that would be.
It is interesting, the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, we've seen, for instance, the head of some of the biggest unions, the GMB, Gary Brown, very important trade union leader, laying into the government because it wants to, laying into the Labour Party because it wants to, not drill any oil and gas in the North Sea. On the other hand, in the end, the TUC does back Labour. It obviously funds Labour, and it isn't going to make this implementation by a Tory government of a tricky pay review body decision easy. Of course it's not going to, particularly when the Labour Party is seen to be on the cusp of power. So, as I say, a major step forward by government. Hopefully there'll be fewer strikes as a result of this. A lot of the public will be pleased to have.
As I
There's still a long way to go.
Yes, Rishi Sunak saying no amount of strikes will change our decision. There are no more talks on pay.
And I think, I have to say, sort of focus groups, opinion polls tend to support that view. A lot of the public are really cheesed off with these strikes. Members of the public who aren't in trade unions, who support the strikes, tend to be very vocal on social media and so on. But I think the polls show that a big silent majority of voters just want people to get on with it. if your average private sector wage increase is 7.3%, that means a lot of people, that's below inflation. That means at least half the people are getting less than that by definition, if they're getting a pay rise at all.
Although we should add maybe that polling is indicating pretty strong support still for the ambulance drivers, the nurses and the doctors. Rail workers perhaps slightly less. But let's just bring in NHS GP Dr Raj Arora, who can join us, because we've not had an official response as yet from the BMA, of course, with the 5 days of action underway. Raj, thanks for your time. We're just looking at the sort of headline rates that the Prime Minister's outlined, and that is 6%, but 9% basically when it got this one-off 1,250 included, way off what the BMA has demanded. But is it going to shift opinion, do you think?
I think it's a really tough one. I think, you know, when you've been told that that's it, you know, there's no other negotiation, it's hard anyway, really. I think we spoke about this before. We've had this chats when the first strikes happened. First of all, even just the beginning, where the whole conversation started, the negotiation started, it's always been, you know, on the wrong foot, I believe. I think with giving 2% was just insulting. And I think now saying this is it, 6%, and then you've got a 9% one-off. What does it really mean for pay restoration? I always go back to this point. It's not even about pay rise, it's about restoration. And actually, you're not getting anything at all. And I know that junior doctors up and down the country will be looking at, you know, their colleagues in Scotland and probably feeling rather disappointed at this point.
Because they had, what, about 12% effectively when you do the sums?
Absolutely. And I think also, just looking at, again, you know, when we look at the NHS long-term workforce plan about retention, growth, etc., it just kind of makes me think, how are we going to do that going forward? Yes, you know, if there are going to be no more conversations, there's not much we can do about that, I guess. But I think going forward, what we want to try and prevent is further strikes or further uproar when it comes to the autumn months as well, when there are pressures on the NHS. So I think there's a lot to be thinking about here. For junior doctors who are 45% of the medical workforce.
And let's not forget, we've got junior doctors now, but very quickly off the back of the junior doctor strikes, we've got the consultant strikes as well. You know, how might they react to what's been announced by the Prime Minister?
Absolutely, and I think Rishi went on to talk about, you know, we need to get the doctors through to get to consultant and they're going to get a pay rise. But, I mean, it doesn't give us much hope if the consultants themselves are striking or thinking of striking as well. So I think really you're putting an offer forward which is in line with other public sector workers, but there has been a pay decline, you know, which has been eroded by the inflation over the last sort of decade and more, going back to 2008. If you're thinking about how we're going to restore that and how we're going to want junior doctors to stay and retain to consultant level, it doesn't seem too promising. But, you know, I'm not the trade union, so I can't speak on their behalf.
Yeah, but from your experience of being in the health service, just looking at this phrase the Prime Minister used, reprioritising, where the estimate is they've got to find this extra $2 billion. I mean, is there any fat in the NHS that they could actually cut to actually finance this?
I think it's going to be a struggle. There's already a big black hole and a deficit. I think also just looking at what we're actually trying to do here. Yes, on one hand, you know, what Rishi Sunak said about not having to take a loan, not having to take debt to obviously, you know, fund the pay rise is good. It's commendable, I guess. But I think it doesn't solve the real issues at home of junior doctors who are burnt out, you know, and who are working those long hours and who don't feel that they're being remunerated or even restored for the work they've been doing. And I think, you know, when you look at the GMC report from last year, 1 in 5 junior doctors are near burnout, and in A&E, you know, an accident emergency and ED, that goes up to 1 in 3. So actually, it's not just about pay. Yes, it is about workforce conditions, but a lot of that feeds into the fact that when you go home, you can't pay your energy bills, you can't live the life you need to live at a basic level. So really, pay is important, and I think it is central to this discussion.
Raj, thank you very much. We'll let you get back to your patients as ever. Thanks for joining us on GB News.
Let's talk to our political reporter, Catherine Forster, who is in Downing Street. As we were saying, tough talking from the Prime Minister, saying that is it. It's a fair deal. It's the only offer on the table. No amount of strikes is going to change that.
Yes, I think that was a very clear message to the junior doctors and indeed to consultants. He was saying this is it. It's fair and it's final. There will be no more talking about this. So basically he's saying to the doctors, take it take this 6.5% or leave it. They've asked, of course, for 36, but he was outlining the many things which he says the government is doing for the NHS. He says it's record funding. They set out, didn't they, the long-term workforce plan over the next 15 years, which is something we haven't had before and was greeted positively pretty much from all sides. So we wait and see what the response will be from the British Medical Association. But much better news for teachers and for children, because the strikes have currently been suspended. There was a statement from the government along with the education union leaders saying that they think they're going to put this offer forward and they recommend that it will be accepted. There'd been a lot of concern about, first of all, them not being given what the pay review body recommended, but also that the money would come out of existing school budgets. Now, journalists have been grilling and are still grilling the Prime Minister's spokesman about this, because the government have said they're not borrowing any more money. So that implies cuts to budget, which might be cuts to teachers, cuts to all of the things that schools have to pay for. The government are saying that's not going to be the case, that it's not going to hurt schools on the front line in that way, that money has been found here and there. It's not terribly clear, I have to say. The devil will be in the detail. But positive news, hopefully, that children, having lost over a week of education this year, those strikes at least might be coming to an end.
But significant too that the teaching unions have accepted this phrase properly funded, because of course we're now learning that Pat McFadden, the Shadow Treasury Minister, has been pushing John Glenn, the Chief Secretary, to the Treasury pretty hardly or pretty effectively in the Commons about what does reprioritising mean? What are the savings? What are the cuts that could come to independent departments? And, you know, is this going to hit education? Is it going to hit health?
Yes, these are the questions, and we don't yet have the answers. There's about £2 or £3 billion additional money needed to be found from somewhere to fund these pay increases for the public sector. And it's not yet clear. The government have said they're not borrowing any more money. They're saying, OK, they're going to make £1 billion or so from this visa scheme and various other bits here and there. They're saying that there are underspends, believe it or not, that they've managed to find. They're reprioritising, but they're claiming that it's not going to hit schools in a direct way. The NHS, yeah, they're claiming that, but still not clear exactly where this money is going to come from.
Catherine, thank you. We're just going to bring you some breaking news. The Met Police say they are aware of a threatening email that's been sent to a school in Redbridge Primary in East London. The report suggesting that it may have been put into lockdown. The Met say they're investigating at pace, but indications, of course, some concern. We'll update you as we get more on that. Pretty sketchy at the moment, but a credible threat, they said, to staff and students.
Do stay with us on GB News. Much more to come, including all the analysis with this massive statement from Rishi Sunak today about public sector workers getting that, well, about 6% pay rise. What do they think? Is it enough to stop junior doctors striking? We'll be asking those questions here on the Live Desk.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
I'm Alex Deakin. This is your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. Sunny spells and more showers today, although not as many and not as heavy the showers as they have been over recent days, and the breeze is at least a little bit lighter. Don't get used to that, however, because two areas of low pressure are merging to bring us a wet and windy spell through Friday and the weekend. But back to this afternoon, it's not completely dry. Some heavy showers still possible across parts of Scotland and later on across East Anglia. One or two lighter showers elsewhere, but actually for a good part of the country it is going to be dry, and at times we'll see a bit of blue sky, the sun will pop out and temperatures will get to around about average for the time of year, high teens across the north, low 20s further south, but feeling a little warmer than yesterday because the winds are a touch lighter. As I said, though, that isn't going to last. The breeze picks up, rain comes into Northern Ireland, across parts of Wales during this evening, spreading to northwest England. But the really wet and windy weather comes into the far southwest later in the night. The wind's really picking up here and some heavy bursts of rain. Temperatures mostly holding up in the teens. On to Friday then, and it is a dry, perhaps bright start over central and eastern England. Northern Scotland may stay dry for most of the day, but one area of rain pushes north, and then this wet and windy weather sweeps in across the southwest Wales, into parts of the Midlands, across southern England and Northern Ireland come the afternoon. That wet and windy weather will last into the weekend for most of us as well. Temperatures again, high teens for most, and feeling cooler with the wind and rain.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here. And really important breaking news. Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the live desk on GB News. Legal moves to prevent 2,000 asylum seekers being housed at RAF Scampton, the famed base of the dam busters, have resumed at the High Court.
Well, the hearing to determine whether the case then can proceed to full judicial review, and that could potentially halt the Home Office plans for this former base in Lincolnshire.
Well, let's cross over to RAF Scampton now and speak with GB News East Midlands reporter Will Hollis. Will, a lot of unhappy residents in the area. I think you might have got one with you by the looks of it.
Yes, well, it's around 158 miles away that ultimately the future of Scampton as well as RAF Weatherfield in Essex is being decided. Right now at the High Court you'll find West Lindsey District Council, which is of course the Lincolnshire Council where Scampton is, and you'll find Braintree District Council, which is the council where RAF Wethersfield is, and they're fighting that battle because ultimately they're trying to get a judicial review. What's happening right now is a permissions hearing just to get to that final stage. But here at Scampton, that's I suppose where the regular average Joe people are. People like Gary. Gary, you're not from Scampton, you're from about 10 minutes down the road along the very noisy A15 towards Lincoln.
Yep.
Why does it matter to you to come up here quite often to protest the asylum seeker plans for Scampton?
Because I saw it on the news and I just thought it can't happen here, so I had to do something, so I just thought I'll sit at the gates, make a start doing that, see where that goes. I can't just sit at home doing nothing. I just can't.
What is it about this place and this plan that you think should not go ahead?
Well, it's the history, the heritage of this place, what they did in the war for us, and now they must be thinking, why did we bother? The money that it's costing. Over £6 million a day on hotels. It's going to cost over £2 billion just for Scampton for 2 years, and over £6 billion for the other camps. What they could spend all on here in the NHS, our homeless veterans. It's disgraceful.
Well, that's the argument, isn't it, really, that they're spending all of this money on the camps, on the hotels, and they're going to find a cheaper way by doing it here at places like RAF Wethersfield and Scampton.
Yeah, but they're still going to have to keep filling the hotels because they're not stopping the boats, and that's the main problem. They're not going to solve anything until they stop that problem first.
And that "stop the boats" has become a bit of a slogan, hasn't it, for Rishi Sunak? It doesn't seem to be...
According to Rishi Sunak, he's stopped the boats already, hasn't he?
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be going too well. Obviously, the asylum seeker plan for Rwanda
that's ridiculous anyway.
That's been stopped in the tracks. How do people here in Lincolnshire feel that this asylum seeker problem is put on their doorstep when ultimately it's a problem for the coastline and basically the government really struggling to get a handle on it?
Well, the government's left it far too long. They've known about it. It's been going on for how many years has this been going on for now? They should have stopped it a long time ago. It's just crazy. It's never going to end. It's never going to end.
How do you see this ending then? Because right now at the High Court they're trying to get this judicial review. We're 150 odd miles away. How do you see this ending with the result that you were hoping for?
Well, I'm really hoping that they see common sense, and there's £300 million investment ready for this place, up and ready to go, and it can't be done while that's on here. So they're just stopping the jobs, investment. There's a lot of jobs and investment here for people in the future, and it's going to be like a museum, heritage place, and it just can't happen.
And that's the big argument for why West Lindsey District Council doesn't want this to happen here. Of course, this is just a permissions hearing that's happening way down in London, but I suppose you could call this the front line, Pips, for what these people really don't want to see happen, which is 2,000 asylum seekers brought to their doorstep.
OK, thank you very much, Will. I mean, we keep calling them asylum seekers, but they all also are people who could well be fleeing some horrific situations. So let's just remember that as well.
Yeah, more from that High Court hearing coming up. Also more from Southwark Crown Court. Kevin Spacey, the actor, Hollywood actor, saying he's not a big flirt and was somewhat intimate with one of his alleged victims. Of course, he denies 12 sex offences involving 4 men between 2001 and 2013. We'll have the latest from that hearing. Latest headlines now with Rhiannon.
Mark, thank you. Good afternoon. It's 1:32, your top stories from the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister has told those still striking to do the right thing and know when to say yes, as he set out pay increases for millions of public sector workers.
Teachers will get a 6.5% rise, while junior doctors will get a 6% rise. Police and prison officers will receive an increase of 7%. Following the announcement, the education unions said the deal will allow strikes to be called off. Rishi Sunak confirmed the pay boost will not be funded by more government borrowing.
Today's offer is final. There will be no more talks on pay. We will not negotiate again on this year's settlements, and no amount of strikes will change our decision. Instead, the settlement we've reached today gives us a fair way to end the strikes, a fair deal for workers and a fair deal for the British taxpayer.
Junior doctors in England, meanwhile, have begun their 5-day strike in what's being described as the longest in the history of the NHS. Members of the British Medical Association are walking out in their dispute over pay, arguing for a rise of around 35%. The row over pay has already led to thousands of cancelled operations and consultations. The Sun says it has a dossier containing serious and wide-ranging allegations against Hugh Edwards, but it has no plans to publish them. It comes as questions are raised regarding the newspaper's conduct as well as the BBC's response to the allegations. The corporation's Director General will be questioned in Parliament next week on how they were handled. The Met Police has found no evidence of criminality. And Virgin Media is under investigation after customers complained of difficulties cancelling their contracts. Customers say when contacting the company to cancel their service, they struggled to speak to an agent or were placed on hold for a long time before their call dropped out. Media watchdog Ofcom says it's concerned about the number of complaints it's received regarding the telecoms company. And you can get more on all of those stories by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
And here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.3070 and 1.1688 euros. The price of gold is £1,499.67 per ounce, and the FTSE 100's at 7,437 points.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for physical investment.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission
of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard.
We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often there will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, welcome back to the live desk on GB News. Oscar-winning actor Kevin Spacey has been in the witness box today as the defence case in his sex offences trial begins.
Well, he's accused of 12 sex offences, including indecent assault, sexual assault and causing a person to engage in sexual activity without consent. And he denies all those charges, but a jury heard accounts from 4 alleged victims yesterday.
The 63-year-old is in the witness box, we understand, still this afternoon. So let's get the very latest from Theo Chikomba, who is outside Southwark Crown Court for us. I imagine the courtroom, the public gallery, has been absolutely packed, Theo.
You're absolutely right. It's been packed throughout the morning and likely for the rest of the afternoon. Many journalists from broadcasters, papers, including the New York Post as well. So in terms of when he arrived here this morning, he arrived with a number of people wearing a grey suit and a light blue tie. But inside, Patrick Gibbs Casey, the defence barrister, addressed the jury at the start of the defence case of the trial of Kevin Spacey. He then began asking Mr. Spacey a number of personal questions, where he grew up, the schools he went to, alongside his upbringing, and then when he went on to have his acting career. Then the court heard about him beginning to attempt to rebuild a theatre here in London called the Old Vic. He was trying to work with some of his colleagues to revamp this place, and it's somewhere where he worked, and they went on to have 54 productions. They then went on to the allegations. The first victim today, the alleged victim, the jury were shown images of him and this alleged victim. He was asked to recollect some of those events when they met and how that relationship began to build. And then when he was asked to see whether he could recollect some of that time and how he was able to obtain some of the information, he spoke about a rental phone, which he says he still uses now here in London. And his business colleague went on to speak to a CEO of this company, and they were then able to find some of this information, texts and so on, and call records dating back to the 2000s. The court then heard about what happened between him and this first alleged victim. And Mr. Spacey went on to say it's not what has been described by this victim. The court heard how he touched this person in a romantic way. He denied saying it was in a violent way. This was a relationship that they had built. They said they both flirted with each other, and as they spent more time together, that relationship began to build. But he did go on to say he made it clear that he didn't want to go further, and Mr. Spacey said, I respected that. So in terms of what we've heard so far this morning, we'll be continuing to hear more evidence this afternoon. But just finally, though, when asked about the relationship with this alleged victim, he said he was never his full-time chauffeur or security, and he was crushed when he heard about these allegations, considering this is the person he knew, and he said he felt that he stabbed him in his back. Kevin Spacey denies all 12 allegations, or charges, shall I say, including sexual assault. The trial continues here at Southwark Crown Court this afternoon.
Thea, thanks very much for updating us on that more, of course, as we hear more in that defence case now. Now, the BBC's Director General, Tim Davies, being called before a House of Lords committee, along with the corporation's acting chair, to answer questions on its handling of the Hugh Edwards allegations.
Meanwhile, mental health charity Mind has called for Hugh Edwards to be given the space to receive treatment. GB News' Home and Security Editor Mark White can bring us the latest from outside Broadcasting House. It has felt, Mark, over the last few days that it's been breaking news, one after the other on this. It does feel a little quieter today, but inside New Broadcasting House, it most certainly isn't, is it?
Yeah, it's a little quieter today in terms of no breaking news about new developments or revelations, but sadly and rather predictably, it is breaking down into a bit of factional fighting between those who take the view that the Sun were right to publish the allegations and those who are on the other side, who are very critical of the Sun and the Murdoch empire, who believe that that newspaper has questions to answer. But while all of that rowing from side to side is going on, here within the BBC, they at least can start now and properly investigate what are a slew of allegations since that original allegation was made to the BBC on the 18th of May and then of course splashed in the Sun newspaper last Friday. Once they passed that on to the police to take a look at to see if they believed there could have been any criminality involved here, they were halted really. They were unable to carry on any more of their internal investigations. Well, now that Scotland Yard has said with regard to that first allegation that they are not going to take it forward, there is no, in their belief, no criminality that's taken place, the BBC can properly begin in earnest now and investigate these allegations. I should say, just going back to Scotland Yard and the statement, there was another allegation within the various claims that have been made over recent days that Hugh Edwards broke lockdown rules to go off and meet a young person in February of 2021, someone outside London. Now, with regard to that particular claim, Scotland Yard say as yet they have not received any material or evidence of this potential lockdown breach. Now, if they did receive that, then we could be looking at a retrospective action here that might result in a fixed penalty notice. We've seen it, of course, before with notable figures like Boris Johnson, even Rishi Sunak.
You say underway now, resuming, but also more external questions, because we're now learning that Tim Davie, the DG, as well as the acting chair, the head of policy as well, all being called before the Lords Communications Committee on Tuesday, and they all want to know more about, well, the BBC's duty of care and its procedures, I guess.
Yeah, this is going to be a difficult one, of course, for Tim Davie to navigate, but really for the Lords to get anything particularly meaningful out of this, given that there are active investigations underway into potentially serious allegations. So with that in mind, I'm sure that Tim Davie and all the advice that he will be given will be going down the road of saying, well, we can't really touch on that because of an ongoing investigation by the corporate investigations team here at Broadcasting House. However, on the other issue about perhaps the complaints procedure and how complaints are dealt with in the early stages, that may be something he can answer in a bit more detail. He did give some explanation when he had a briefing with reporters at the beginning of the week. That was, of course, to launch the BBC's annual report, but it was hijacked by all of this scandal. And he did acknowledge that they are going to review, as a matter of urgency, their complaints procedure to see how they red flag complaints of a potentially serious nature.
Mark, outside New Broadcasting House for us once more. Thanks very much for bringing us the latest there.
Let's speak now to former BBC Home Affairs correspondent Danny Shaw, who you believe, I understand, that the corporation has a duty of care towards the broadcaster now, towards Hugh Edwards, after what has emerged about what is clearly, you know, his severe depression.
I think that's right, Pip. I mean, I'm critical of the BBC because I don't think they dealt with the complaint properly when it came in initially on the 18th of May, the 19th of May. They didn't investigate it properly. They made a phone call and an email to try and speak to the complainant. That doesn't strike me as a very robust or rigorous investigation into what we now know was serious allegations. That term, serious allegations, was a term used by Tim Davie, the BBC Director General. Well, if you're getting serious allegations about your most high-profile news presenter who has mental health concerns, well-documented history of severe depression, A, the investigation was inadequate, and B, what steps were made to check on his welfare and his mental well-being? Because we now know that the allegations were that he had paid £35,000 to a young person. Well, that's really serious and concerning behaviour by someone. It might be private behaviour, but you would have thought that Hugh Edwards' managers would have been informed, and perhaps a check on his mental health would have been carried out, because if that story became public, that would have a detrimental effect on his mental health. And it may be that the alleged behaviour was as a consequence of his mental health struggles. But in any event, that complaint was not dealt with properly in any sense at all, from everything we know about it, until The Sun contacted the BBC almost 7 weeks later.
And are you surprised or puzzled the fact that Tim Davie has acknowledged that as Director General he didn't speak to Hugh Edwards directly and raising these issues, because he is now having to answer questions, for instance, in front of this Lords Committee next Tuesday?
Look, I think whether Tim Davie himself spoke to Hugh Edwards or whether someone from his executive team or Hugh Edwards' line manager spoke to him, I don't think that is really the point here. I think the point is the way the BBC handled it in those 7 weeks was very poor. I also think there was a point over the weekend, last weekend, when Hugh Edwards or the BBC should have named him as the presenter who was at the centre of these allegations when they announced that he was suspended. We're in a ridiculous situation where other people were being wrongly named, and their lives were being affected by that.
Yeah,
and
but you will know. I'm sorry to interrupt, Danny, but you will know. Let's just make clear that they were prevented effectively from doing that by that Supreme Court ruling after the Cliff Richard case that the BBC was involved in.
Well, look, it's how you interpret court rulings, Mark. A court ruling isn't a definitive yes or no. It's about your interpretation of court rulings. And people's expectations of privacy depend upon who they are and what they've said and what they put into the public domain. Hugh Edwards is a very high-profile, extremely well-paid news presenter. He's a trusted figure. He's in the public eye, and he's also voluntarily revealed a lot of details about his private life and his struggles with mental health, and we all have great sympathy for that. And, it's to his credit that he's done that. But when you reveal details about your private life, the expectation of your entitlement to privacy, I think, is lower, and the bar is lower. It's far lower for him than it would be for a producer working at the BBC who has no public profile at all. And I don't think the BBC quite understood that. And I think he should have been named earlier than he was. And he could have denied the allegations and talked about his mental health struggles. And we wouldn't be in this situation now, I don't think.
Home Affairs correspondent Danny Shaw, really interesting to speak to you about this. Thanks for talking to us on GB News. Police are currently searching an area in a hamlet in the French Alps before calling off the massive operation to locate missing 2-year-old Emile. We're not quite sure of his full name, but we do understand it to be Emile. Investigators say their focus will now shift to evaluating the evidence already gathered if they don't find the toddler who was last seen walking down the street near his grandparents' house in the French Alps. 5 days later, there is still no sign of the boy.
Let's speak now to French journalists in Paris, Nabila Rabdani, who can join us. Nabila, we gather this has obviously, for understandable reasons, gripped people in France there as they follow this, but it does seem that the widespread, or the wide-scale, rather, search is now being called off, so clearly this is getting quite serious.
Well, yes, indeed. You're quite right to say that it's captured. Emil's disappearance has captured the public's imagination. It's all over the French media in France. Politicians and ministers are calling the general public to keep looking out for Emile. This is clearly a terrifying story that is creating a huge amount of worry across France, but also evidently in other parts of the world, including Britain. And it doesn't matter what nationality or indeed background little Emile is. You just have to look at that picture of a beautiful little blonde boy who looks as charming as he is vulnerable. And, it's a truism to say that looking at losing someone like little Emile is clearly any adult's nightmare. Having said that, the search started soon after Emile went missing on Saturday evening. Remember, he was staying at his grandparents' house in a very rural part of the Alps. Varennes is actually a village, the village where he was in, and it only has about 20 houses. And it soon turns into thick forests. But because Emile is so small, it was thought that a rigorous search of a 3-mile perimeter would soon find him. And at one stage, there were even helicopters involved, which were playing recordings of his mother's voice in the hope that he would hear the recordings and come out of hiding. But as you said, last night, the local prosecutor, who's in charge of the investigation, called off the physical search, that is to say, the beating of the countryside involving police and indeed detectives, which effectively means that Emile has been taken out of the area. And in one sense, this is optimistic on some level, because it means that Emile could be somewhere else. But it's terrifying at the same time, because a 2-year-old would evidently need help to go anywhere else.
Indeed.
And therefore, the judicial investigation.
I was going to say, therefore, the fact that they've effectively called off that as we saw the pictures there, very widespread search operation. I mean, what are the ideas that they're looking at now? What are the theories that police are investigating?
Well, the judicial investigation is still going on. It's been opened up to inquiries further afield. The prosecutor and police are now looking at any known child abuse offenders living in the area, for example. They're looking at car movement. They're looking at phone signals and trying to pinpoint who was where at about 5 p.m. Last Saturday, Emile disappeared. And even before that, they're interviewing people to see if their testament tally. They are using phone technology known as triangulation to try to locate people using their phone. It's important to say that at this stage, there is no evidence. Nothing has been found. Not a trace of Emile has been found yet. No DNA, no hair follicle. The police found some blood on the front of a car yesterday, but it was analysed and it turned out to be animal blood. So there is still hope that Emile is alive and can be found. But there's also the terrifying fear that he may have been kidnapped.
Yes,
a 2-year-old can't get very far by himself. If he had fallen over and lay in a bush somewhere, then he probably would have been found by now by police searches. Almost a week after he disappeared.
Yeah, so a terrible time for his family, of course. But Nabila, thank you for updating us on that. More, of course, from Paris, if and when they develop further lines of questioning. Thank you very much indeed.
Do stay with us here on GB News, where we'll be returning to the news that the government has offered at least 6% pay rise for public sector workers. See you shortly.
A brighter outlook with Boxed Solar. Proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Afternoon, I'm Alex Deakin and this is your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. A wet and windy spell of weather is on the way, arriving tonight and lasting for much of tomorrow and into the weekend, courtesy of these two areas of low pressure, in particular this one, which is heading up towards the southwest. Now, ahead of that, many of us have had the driest day of a pretty showery week. There are still some heavy showers around across parts of eastern England and Scotland, and further outbreaks of mostly light rain pushing into Northern Ireland, North Wales and North West England during this evening. But here comes A band of heavier rain accompanied by some strong and gusty winds, temperatures mostly holding up in the teens. Now these winds will be pretty lively, particularly for this time of year. So it's going to be a blustery day over southwest England and Wales. There'll be heavy rain as well, exacerbating the miserable feel, but also making for some pretty tricky travelling conditions. The Met Office do have a yellow warning in place for those winds. The rain will spread across much of England, Northern Ireland and into southern Scotland by the end of the day. Some brighter spells in the southeast could see highs of 22, but generally temperatures in the high teens and feeling cooler with that gusty wind. It's a blustery day for many on Saturday. You can see this big swirl, it's low pressure, but the strongest winds on Saturday over parts of the Midlands, East Anglia and southeast England. Another Met Office warning in place for those gusty winds. There'll be plenty of heavy showers moving across the country as well. Blustery conditions throughout the day with temperatures high teens, low 20s.
A brighter outlook with Boxed Solar. Proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my new show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m, where real people get to meet those in power and hold them to account. Every week, we'll be hearing your views from up and down the country in the real world. Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Prime Minister unveils pay deals of more than 6% for public sector workers. Teaching unions immediately call off their strike. As Rishi Sunak warns others, it's time to say yes.
Junior doctors, though, today began a 5-day walkout. Thousands of appointments have been cancelled.
The Battle of Scampton resuming in the High Court. The local council challenging the Home Office over plans to house 2,000 people at the former RAF Dambusters base. We're live at the hearing.
And we'll be talking about why the pound in your pocket matters to buskers. We'll be reporting from the streets of Glasgow on the musicians getting in tune with the GB News Don't Kill Cash campaign. Before that, your headlines with Rhiannon.
Pip, thank you. Good afternoon. It's 2 minutes past 2. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister has told those still striking to do the right thing and know when to say yes, as he set out pay increases for millions of public sector workers. Teachers will get 6.5%, while junior doctors will get a 6% rise. Police and prison officers will receive an increase of 7%. Teachers' unions say the new pay recommendations will allow them to call off strike action. Rishi Sunak says the pay increases won't be funded by more government borrowing and warns there'll be no more negotiating.
Today's offer is final. There will be no more talks on pay. We will not negotiate again on this year's settlements, and no amount of strikes will change our decision. Instead, the settlement we've reached today gives us a fair way to end the strikes, a fair deal for workers and a fair deal for the British taxpayer.
Well, that as junior doctors in England are on strike in what's being described as the longest in the history of the NHS. Members of the British Medical Association have begun a 5-day walkout in their dispute over pay, arguing for a rise of around 35%. The row's already led to thousands of cancelled operations and consultations. Speaking to GB News, Dr Basha Mukherjee says the money is there.
As a result of this strike action, they're having to pay £200 an hour to the consultants to cover our shifts effectively. And you're telling me that they can't pay us a 35% rise, which is, for me, is just going to be £25 an hour, which is a massive drop from £200 an hour, which they're taking just to cover the consultant fees to do by not a consultant's job, a junior doctor.
Mental health charity Mind says people like Hugh Edwards experiencing serious mental health problems should be given the space to receive treatment. Questions have been raised regarding the Sun's conduct, as well as the BBC's response to the allegations he paid a young person for sexually explicit images. The corporation's Director General will be questioned in Parliament next week on how they were handled. The Met Police has found no evidence of criminality. Former BBC executive Roger Bolton told GB News the corporation is obliged to scrutinise allegations.
We've got to be very careful about this, of course, because Hugh Edwards can't reply to this. And when it comes to sort of, how can I put this, sexual politics, there's a vast difference between aging older people, like me, for example, whatever, and young women in particular, say in their 20s, have very different views about what constitutes uncomfortable things. But I just think that in this instance, give the information to the BBC, let them report. Now, let us scrutinise. The BBC has absolute obligation to come public on all of this, but it doesn't have to do it now.
Well, GB News has spoken to people around the country to get their thoughts.
I think they need to drop it from the news. He's obviously got serious mental health issues, and at the moment we don't consider the ramifications for his family.
He's going to disappear into the wilderness. That's all. He's finished, isn't he? Really, basically, he's finished. Like Schofield, he's finished.
I think people need to leave him alone. Mental health is so severe, and each person handles it a different way. Allegations and rumours cause traumatic behaviour, which is probably what's made him completely go off the edge.
Virgin Media is under investigation after customers complained of difficulties cancelling their contracts. Customers say when contacting the company to cancel their service, they struggled to speak to an agent or were placed on hold for a long time before eventually dropping out. Media watchdog Ofcom says it's concerned about the number of complaints it's received regarding the telecoms company. And footballer Dele Alli has revealed he was sexually abused when he was 6 years old and was dealing drugs by the time he was 8. Speaking to Gary Neville on his podcast, The Overlap, the Everton midfielder says he recently spent 6 weeks in rehab because of a sleeping pill addiction and mental health issues. He's also revealed he smoked at the age of 7 and was sent to Africa to learn discipline. Ali says his adoptive parents have helped him turn his life around.
Yeah, 12 I was adopted, so. And from then, it was like, I was adopted by an amazing family, like I said. I couldn't have asked for better people to do what they've done for me. If God created people, it was them.
This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens now, though. It's back to Mark and Pip.
Welcome back to the live desk. So, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak announcing a pay rise for all public sector workers of at least 6 to 7% to try and stave off further industrial action. Teaching unions saying they're already suspending their strikes and putting the deal to their members.
However, the funding for the pay rises will have to come out of existing departmental budgets.
And that's where the problems begin. Of course, we've got the junior doctors out on the streets for 5 days on the picket lines. We've already got reaction from the president of the Hospital Consultants and Specialists Association, Dr. Narayan. Instead of serious negotiation on doctors' pay, he said, we've had a grandstanding PR stunt, which remains scant on detail, going on to say, we do know that this is an imposed outcome with funding apparently coming from NHS cost-cutting. Slicing into health budgets is no way to resolve industrial action centred on staffing and retention and overall the concern for patient care.
Well, let's get more on this with our business and economics editor, Liam Halligan. There's plenty to discuss in On the Money. As we would expect, Liam, we're already getting the criticism coming. You know, it's a PR stunt. Do you think the Prime Minister has been sensible in his announcement? Has he been fair? He claims he's being fair.
I certainly think this is a serious attempt to bring these strikes to a close, these public sector strikes, which have got a lot of the public cheesed off, of course. And Rishi Sunak can say that he is at least following the pay review bodies, the independent organisations who come up with the amount of pay and can arbitrate between the government and the public sector unions. Let's just have a look at some of the details, Pip, if we may. So ministers have accepted that 6 to 6.5% pay rise, as you just reported. That is in line with the official pay review bodies. It's worth saying that inflation in May was 8.7%. That's, of course, during the year to May, from May 2022 to May 2023. Over the coming year, when this pay will be implemented, inflation may well be quite a lot lower than that. So these may, in fact, be above inflation pay rises. We're not quite sure, at least going forward. And as you say, most NHS staff are getting a 5% increase. But on top of that, a lot of NHS staff are getting a one-off annual payment just for 1 year, not baked in for all their future pay, which takes their increase for this year only to 8 or 9%. Just to correct one little thing, it's not the case that everyone's getting at least 6%. This only applies to about half the public sector. Right. About a fifth of us work in the public sector. This applies to half the public sector. It doesn't apply to most civil servants. And then the armed forces deserve a special mention. They're getting just 5%.
And interesting, you talk about civil servants. Mike Clancy, General Secretary of Prospect, the union, basically saying that they're taking a knife to public services to pay for these pay rises, signalling they've learnt nothing from the austerity years, more than a decade of underfunding, leaving us unprepared for the pandemic. In particular, freezing civil service recruitment in the Ministry of Defence, for instance, a disastrous area of risks, putting our nation's security at risk. So I guess it all comes down to what the Prime Minister has talked about in terms of reprioritising budgets to actually make up, was about a 2 billion shortfall we've worked out roughly.
Yeah, I'd say that's pretty incendiary language. There are far more civil servants now than there were pre the COVID pandemic, for instance. Not to say that they don't all do a great job. Lots of them work from home, of course, which many people would suggest is the reason why public sector productivity has literally fallen off a cliff. It's also worth saying that if Rishi Sunak had said we're going to raise taxes to pay for this, well,
or borrow,
the tax burden is already at a 70-year high. That's not going to do much to get the economy going. Or, as you say, Mark, rightly, if the Prime Minister said we're going to borrow, then that would be inflationary, which would be counterproductive. So I think he's trying to strike a balance. They do have to make some savings. Rishi Sunak has tried to sort of kill two birds with one stone by saying some of the savings are going to be offset by the fact that the government's going to charge more for visas. Yeah. They're going to charge more for so-called NHS tourism when people come to this country.
£1 billion worth,
they will be charged. That's clever politics because it addresses issues that are obviously in the news with the small boats. You've been reporting all day about Scampton and RAF Wethersfield near my home in North Essex. I know the village very, very well and how strong feelings are there. But I have to say, you know, getting money from NHS tourism, if you like, getting money for it's a very slow burn. It's very drip, drip. It's not a big wave of cash.
And can they get that billion every year? Is it a constant figure?
There you go. There you go. Well, some of the pay rises only apply for 1 year, don't they? Yeah. But you're right. This is, for the most part, it's the permanent increase in expenditure. What I would say is even though, you know, billions of pounds or thousands of millions, they're very, very big, in the grand scheme of hundreds of billions of public sector spending in the round, 2 or 3 billion here is a rounding error. And say if interest rates don't go up as high as we expect them to go, government debt costs are less. They have to pay less to service the big government debt that we've got. There'll be savings there.
Yeah, and would there have been also a calculation about how much industrial action has been costing the economy as well, with, 8 months so far of
Absolutely. You know, industrial action costs money. You heard there from a young junior doctor who is absolutely doing the right thing from her perspective, coming on...
The strikes in April by the NHS apparently cost £100 million. That's what it cost hospitals just in April.
Indeed. That young doctor there, you know, she's coming on GBNews and saying that she's angry, she wants 35%. That's fair enough. That's what we do in a democracy. She made the point, I thought it was germane, it was a good part of her argument, that the government is having to fill in consultants at 200 quid an hour, whereas junior doctors, they get sort of between 20 and 30 pounds an hour. So wouldn't it be cheaper to resolve the strikes? Of course, the government has to pay money for replacements in emergency services when there are strikes. On the other hand, I think the government's made a calculation here. It doesn't really do them any harm, particularly to be seen to be facing down public sector unions that are hand in glove, literally lining the pockets, as the Tories would see it, of the Labour Party. It's very awkward, these strikes for Labour, because they can't really oppose them, but they can't really support them either.
And they weren't
There's a little bit of political calculation.
In fact, Labour weren't giving an answer on whether they would agree to the public service pay awards from the independent pay review bodies.
Absolutely. So now, of course, another autumn of public sector strikes would be a major pain in the nation's posterior as far as the majority are concerned, and they would be a pain for the Conservatives. But I do think there's some thinking in Downing Street that they could have knocked these strikes on the head with a big amount of money earlier, but I think there's some Machiavellian calculation going on that perhaps it isn't all bad to see Labour squirm.
OK, on that thought, let's get some more reaction as it comes through. But let's speak, I think, now to maths teacher Bobby Seagull. Bobby, you're pretty good at the numbers, so let's run through some of the numbers that we've got for you. And in terms of the teachers, at least a £30,000 starting salary, a deal of 6.5%, and the Prime Minister asserting properly funded. But still this question, you know, will there be cuts elsewhere to make the money work?
Yeah, so first thing I'd like to say is that I'm at least glad that the Prime Minister is following through on his sort of claims on the value of education, because when he started his term, he's maintained that education is a silver bullet to solving our country's issues. And he's following through with that. So we know that in negotiations, unions will say they want X percent, 10, 11%, and the government starts off with a lower rate, and we come to the middle. And it feels as if maybe if he does follow through on this 6.5%, that is a sort of reasonable middle ground. But I guess as an educator, the big question, again, is the devil is in the detail. Where does the funding come from? So the government does say right now it's not going to come from existing budgets. So if we as educators, teachers, can see where that funding is coming from, I think we will feel a lot happier.
Yeah, because the government's agreed to provide additional funding for the pay rises, as well as a hardship fund of up to 40 million to support schools facing the greatest financial challenges.
Yeah, and again, these are, 40 million in the big scheme of things, how many schools we have. It's probably a small amount, but again, we always welcome additional funding to the sector. And I think it's a case of, with unions now, it looks as if in the autumn they're going to call off the strikes, which is a great thing, because when people enter the teaching profession, you want to educate our future generations. Actually, strikes are always the last measure. And again, when teachers go on strikes, we lose pay. It's not as if we're getting away with the scot-free. We're losing income ourselves.
Yeah, good point. And of course, the Prime Minister, very early on in that news conference, saying that the teaching unions had suspended their planned strikes immediately. I mean, I know, obviously, the figures have got to be put to votes by the separate unions, but I guess indicating that perhaps there is a slightly better relationship now between the government and the unions, because that's one of the issues, of course. You know, as you say, teachers thinking we're just not valued.
Because there has been a frosty relationship between the unions and the government. And again, there's always a sort of a separation. You've got the teachers there, and then you've got the unions, and then you've got the government there. The unions, I guess, are the intermediary between the teachers and the government. And it feels as if this may be the breakthrough we've been waiting for, because, again, every time there's a strike day, it impacts the teachers, impacts parents, impacts the young people being educated. So hopefully this is the start of actually, we've got something on the table. Now let's get the details. Because, again, in politics, we know that a headline is great. It will take some pressure off the Prime Minister, but we need to see exactly where the funding is coming from.
And the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, we're hearing that she privately urged the Treasury to agree to that rise for teachers, what is said to be the highest pay award for 30 years. So, to a point, she was on their side.
Yes, again, they're in challenging positions. And again, I thank Gillian Keegan for being on the side of teachers in this particular case. But again, the bigger macro picture is, like many sectors, so teachers are not unique, but teachers have faced anything between a 13% to 23%, depending on the figures you look at, a real terms pay cut. So when you're looking at the doctors, the rail workers, they're all talking about pay restoration. This doesn't restore pay to what it would have been in 2010, but it's at least a measure showing that the government is serious in trying to tackle the key issue of the strikes.
OK, Bobby Seagull, really good to have your thoughts on that pay award for teachers. Let's go straight to Birmingham, where GB News West Midlands reporter Jack Carson has been with junior doctors. Jack, are you getting any reaction from them, this public sector award of around 6%?
Well, the junior doctors here on the picket line left that picket line at 10 a.m. this morning because, of course, for this latest round of junior doctors strike, the longest strike amount of strike days that they've done consecutively in history, it's going to last till Monday. The picket line, as advised by the British Medical Association, was only for 8 a.m. till 10 a.m. today, and they've given them the option and giving them guidance over the next few days on how to, rather than go on a picket line like we saw hundreds of nurses, thousands of nurses across the country do, for junior doctors, they've been advised to play rounders, catch up with friends and recuperate from their workloads, in the words of the British Medical Association. But actually looking at this public sector pay rise and what's been offered particularly to junior doctors, it's 6% plus a £1,250 consolidated increase. That, of course, is far off from the 35% that the British Medical Association has said it is his demand from the government and Steve Barclay. Steve Barclay said that anything offered 5%, anything above that, he said, would lead to measures. But I spoke to Dr. Shivan Sharma, who's a junior doctor here at the University Hospitals Trust in Birmingham, and he said that 35% increase is all about pay restoration.
Pay is the main issue. So doctors, after 5 to 6 years of medical school, we graduate with about £100,000 worth of student debt, and then you start on a salary of £14 an hour. And that too, you have to pay for your own exams, your own courses, your own presentations, your own publications. And all we're asking for is full pay restoration. That's a mere £5 to £10 increase in the average salary of doctors. So instead of a doctor being paid £14 an hour, they'll be paid £19 an hour. And if you ask any of the member of the general public, if they're in hospital at 7 p.m. on a Friday night, do they think it's reasonable for their doctor to be paid £19 an hour? And I think the resounding answer you'd get is yes.
Well, here at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, of course, that talk on the picket line this morning that 5% wasn't good enough, 35% is what they wanted. We know in Scotland there is a vote with the British Medical Association for 17.8%. That is going to be put to the members. So whether this public sector rise of 6% is going to be enough for the British Medical Association to stop their industrial action and put that vote put that deal to a vote with their members here in England, it's unlikely. We've not heard from them yet, but the NHS is urging the unions and the government to come to a negotiating table, to come to a deal, because over the last 8 months when this industrial action has happened, 650,000 appointments have had to be rescheduled, adding to those already record waiting times.
Jack, thanks very much indeed for updating us there in Birmingham. Let's just bring you a bit of breaking news that we're getting from the Prince of Wales. In a personal tweet, Prince William expressing his support for the footballer Dele Alli, who you heard there in the news bulletin with Rhiannon, has spoken about his mental health struggles. The Everton midfielder revealing he was sexually abused at the age of 6, then dealing with drugs by the time he was just 8 years old. Prince William in the tweet saying, brave and inspirational, discussing mental health is not a sign of weakness. Let's keep the conversation going. We're all with you. We wish you the very best. W. More reaction on that coming up. Let's get the weather for you now.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers. Proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Afternoon, I'm Alex Deakin and this is your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. A wet and windy spell of weather is on the way, arriving tonight and lasting for much of tomorrow and into the weekend, courtesy of these two areas of low pressure, in particular this one, which is heading up towards the southwest. Now, ahead of that, many of us have had the driest day of a pretty showery week. There are still some heavy showers around across parts of eastern England and Scotland, and further outbreaks of mostly light rain pushing into Northern Ireland, North Wales and northwest England during this evening. But here comes a band of heavier rain accompanied by some strong and gusty winds, temperatures mostly holding up in the teens. Now, these winds will be pretty lively, particularly for this time of year. So it's going to be a blustery day over southwest England and Wales. There'll be heavy rain as well, exacerbating the miserable feel, but also making for some pretty tricky travelling conditions. The Met Office do have a yellow warning in place for those winds. The rain will spread across much of England, Northern Ireland and into southern Scotland by the end of the day. Some brighter spells in the southeast could see highs of 22, but generally temperatures in the high teens and feeling cooler with that gusty wind. It's a blustery day for many on Saturday. You can see this big swirl, it's low pressure, but the strongest winds on Saturday over parts of the Midlands, East Anglia and southeast England. Another Met Office warning in place for those gusty winds. There'll be plenty of heavy showers moving across the country as well. Blustery conditions throughout the day with temperatures high teens, low 20s.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers. Proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "No, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the people's channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Live Desk. Now, the BBC's Director General Tim Davies being called before a House of Lords committee, along with the corporation's acting chair, all to answer questions on its handling of those Hugh Edwards allegations.
Meanwhile, mental health charity Mind has called for Hugh Edwards to be given the space to receive treatment. GB News' Homes and Security Editor Mark White can bring us the latest from outside Broadcasting House, or New Broadcasting House. Mark, a little quieter today, though, but plenty of discussions going on inside the BBC.
Yeah, I mean, it's enormously difficult, this story, of course, because no one wants to worsen the mental state of Hugh Edwards following the revelation from his wife yesterday that he'd taken a very bad turn, having suffered from severe depression for a number of years and was hospitalised. And, you know, he will be in hospital, according to his wife, for the foreseeable future. So clearly people are concerned about that. But having said that, there are allegations that need to be explored now by the BBC, now that it has been freed up by the Metropolitan Police, who are not going to bring a criminal investigation in this case. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, in his news conference about the pay awards, was asked about this, and, you know, he delicately answered the question as well. Let's listen.
For the reasons that everyone is aware of, this is an incredibly sensitive matter, and what I'd say is that the BBC is going through its process of fact-finding and establishing what's happened. The right thing is for them to get on with that, and for us to give them the space to do that and recognise the sensitivity of this for all involved. And there's nothing more than that I can or should say, I think, at this point.
Mark, we've got the internal inquiry now resuming in the building behind you into what's a fact-finding mission, they say. But clearly there is still outside interest too as to the way the BBC's handled this. And we've got the DG, the acting chair, the head of policy, all appearing before a House of Lords committee next week to answer questions.
Yes, and it might be difficult for him to answer very much about the ongoing investigation by the Corporate Investigations team, as you would imagine, given that they are in the very early stages of assessing what are now a number of allegations. But I think the issue that perhaps he can touch on in a bit more depth, because he did talked to it to some degree earlier in the week when he was launching the BBC's annual report, and that event was hijacked really by all of the questions which were on this particular issue around Hugh Edwards. He did say that the initial complaint that was made on the 18th of May by a family member, the mother of a person who they believed was vulnerable and was being paid money by Hugh Edwards to send explicit photographs. That, they say, was a serious allegation, regardless of whether there was any criminality at the end of the day, and it should have been acted on in a timely manner. But we know, of course, there was an email sent the next day. They didn't get a reply from the complainant, the family member, and of course they tried one phone call, which was 2.5 weeks later, and then nothing else was done.
Yeah.
No other emails, no telephone call to the complainant, to the family members, to try to chase this up until the Sun approached the BBC with their story. And it was only at that point as well that Hugh Edwards was told about the very serious allegations that had been made some 7 weeks earlier.
Now, Mark, while you're there, there's some breaking news coming through on a story you've been covering for us as Home Affairs editor. We're being told the government has now been given the go-ahead to bring its Supreme Court challenge over the Rwanda deportation policy. Now, this is the last rung, if you like, on that legal ladder.
Yes, well, this was a very significant setback for the government when just a matter of weeks ago it lost in the Court of Appeal that challenge, or at least they weren't even challenging. It was some asylum seekers and representative support groups, charities, that brought a case against the government and their plans to send some asylum seekers who cross illegally across the channel to Rwanda for processing. They challenged that at the Court of Appeal, having lost the initial case at the High Court. And the government were, from everyone that I was talking to, quite confident that the Court of Appeal would also find in their favour. So it came as a significant blow for Rishi Sunak, for the Home Secretary Suella Braverman, and the team trying to implement this policy. It's meant now just further delay. And yes, say the Court of Appeal, no surprise really that they have agreed that this can go to the Supreme Court, because you'll remember that it was not a unanimous decision by the 3 appeal court judges. One of those judges, in fact the Lord Chief Justice, believed that actually the policy was lawful. So given that split, I think it was absolutely given that this was going to go to the Supreme Court. But it adds further delay to it, doesn't it, Mark? We're going to be probably looking at October before I think there may be a Supreme Court case penciled in, a hearing to hear this. And then those judges will have to go off and decide on the merits of both sides of this argument again. So it could be the end of the year, the beginning of next year, before we actually get a definitive ruling from the highest court in the land.
And it has to be said, Mark, that the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, they are talking very confidently about the fact that they think they've got an excellent case and that they will win it. The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, only telling MPs the other day that she would do whatever it takes to stop the boats, although on the other side, Labour says the plan is completely unethical.
Yeah, well, they may think that, but they lost just a matter of weeks ago at the Court of Appeal. So nothing is certain in going forward with this appeal to the highest court in the land. And all of the while, of course, the clock is ticking. We are looking into next year at a general election, and the Prime Minister has said it is one of his 5 pledges to stop the boats. Not only is he not stopping the boats, but it's looking, after an initial claim by Rishi Sunak that actually the number of people coming across the channel had dropped by 20% on the period when he made this announcement about a month and a bit ago, when he said that the number coming across was 20% down. Well, there was an improvement in the weather, and what happened? Thousands more came across the channel. So we're now sitting at more than 13,000 people who've crossed the English Channel this year, and that is equivalent to the number at the same time last year. And despite the fact that for quite a few months of the early part of this year. We've had less than favourable conditions in the Channel and usually a northeasterly wind, which has the effect of pushing against the prevailing tides and pushing back onto the beaches of northern France and make it largely impassable for these boats to come. But every time we get to flat calm conditions, we get these large surges of people trying to cross. So they're still there, they're still trying to cross, whatever Rishi Sunak might say about his small boats policy working.
Indeed. Mark, thank you very much indeed for updating us on that breaking news, as well as the situation at the BBC. Of course, just to reaffirm that breaking news coming through, the government giving the go-ahead to bring a Supreme Court challenge over the Rwanda deportation policy after it was rejected, of course, by the appeal court. More reaction to come. Stay with us here on the Live Desk.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is two new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prisons? I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard. We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often they will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Well, welcome back to the Live Desk. Let's update you now on legal efforts to prevent 2,000 asylum seekers from being housed at RAF Scampton, that famed base of the dam busters. It's been continuing at the High Court today.
The hearing is due to determine whether the case can proceed to a full judicial review, which could potentially halt the Home Office's plans for the former base in Lincolnshire. Well, let's cross over to the Royal Courts of Justice and get the latest with our political reporter, Olivia Utley. Olivia, bring us up to speed then. What has the court been hearing so far today?
Well, yeah, we're yet to get a decision from the court. This is just the preliminary hearing to decide whether or not this case can go to a full judicial review. And essentially, West Lindsey District Council has been arguing that it's unlawful for the government to house 2,000 migrants at RAF Scampton. Now, there are two main points of argument that they've come up with today. We've had Richard Wald, Casey, fighting on their behalf. One is that there is a £300 million regeneration project for RAF Scampton that was conceived in 2018. Work has been progressing on it ever since then. And they say that if the Home Office is allowed to house 2,000 migrants at the RAF Scampton site, which are, mainly young men allowed to come and go as they please, then it's thought that investors in this £300 million heritage and tourism project will bow out and choose to invest elsewhere. Now, West Lindsey District Council say that this area of Scampton is in dire need of urgent renovation, and if they're going to level up the community as they would like to do, then that £300 million worth of investment is absolutely crucial. The other point that Richard Wald has been making is that Suella Braverman isn't being particularly open and transparent about how long she plans to house these 2,000 migrants at this site. When she speaks to residents, she says that it'll just be 12 months, and they claim that she only has the right to hold them there for 12 months. But when she speaks in Parliament, and according to some of the documents that she's put forward proposing this scheme, it sounds more as though it would be longer term, more like 3 years to 5 years. And of course, that's pretty troubling for those people who have put a lot of money, investment into this regeneration project. The issue for the government, of course, is that there's a pretty big bottleneck of migrants who are waiting for their asylum applications to be processed. It now takes over a year for the average asylum application to be processed, and there are still migrants coming in their hundreds across the Channel most weeks. So they have a large number of migrants who they need to house, but pretty much everywhere where they propose a migrant housing settlement, a local MP or a local council says, no, not in our backyard. And that's what we're hearing today from West Lindsey District Council and from Braintree Council.
Well, we're just going to break away for a moment there because we've got an interruption with Olivia there at that court hearing. Clearly, this is discussing the situation in terms of Scampton. Just to update you on that breaking news that we had on the Rwanda policy separately, the government, we're told, can now appeal to the Supreme Court on the whole bigger question of its Rwanda deportation policy. And Rishi Sunak had obviously indicated he would seek that appeal as he fundamentally disagreed with the Court of Appeal's ruling that it was unlawful. So that's a separate development. But let's head back now to get more detail on Scampton and speak to our East Midlands reporter, Will Hollis, who was there. And Will, just to explain to people, the legal proceedings underway in London, a result of what the local authority and, of course, some individuals there want to happen.
Yes, well, it's around 158 miles from RAF Scampton down to the Royal Courts of Justice, and while West Lindsey District Council and, of course, Braintree Council, that's representing the RAF Wethersfield area, are there involved in the thick of it, I suppose this is really where it matters, and this is why where you'll find residents and local people that have been very vocal since March, when Robert Jenrick stood up in the House of Commons and announced that former RAF bases and airfields just like this were his method for solving the problem with the bulging asylum system. It was only about 6 months, a year ago, that RAF Scampton was properly closed. Before, when we started reporting on this, there were still signs outside for RAF Scampton. There was still a Red Arrows jet because, of course, the Red Arrows were here. But now a lot of that has gone. All of the flags have been taken down from the building, and they've been gone for quite some months. But you will notice something that is here and is pretty much permanently here, and that's the residents, the local people. I've been speaking to them a little bit about why they don't want this to happen. You'll probably see in the background on the signs or in the pictures that we've been sending back. There are a couple of things that they say. They say no to the asylum centre, but the thing that we're seeing most of all is £300 million worth of investment, and that's, of course, course, because there was a plan and is a plan to pump all of this money into this heritage site and make it a world-class visitor attraction. So that really is the big argument. But of course, you're hearing other things around safety as well that are often quite common in these sorts of places. The Home Office's argument is, of course, is that it's costing them £6 million a day to put asylum seekers and migrants into hotels, and they see by putting thousands of them at places like RAF Wethersfield and RAF Scampton, that will alleviate some of the pressure that towns and cities across the UK are feeling right now.
And of course, you know, there is a legitimate argument that if the government had been much better at tackling this backlog a long time ago, then this wouldn't be happening, and all these local people wouldn't be feeling as aggrieved as they are.
Yes, the old saying is, of course, prevention is better than cure. It's what you'll hear from the Labour Party. They'll be saying right now that we should have sorted this out earlier. This should have been a better asylum policy. Places like Manston should have been sorted out a long time ago. Of course, it is a growing problem. Every year, the number of people coming to Britain on small boats goes up. But of course, we've got a general election coming in the near future. If, let's say, the Labour Party gets into power and Keir Starmer becomes the Prime Minister, this will then become his problem, and then it means that whoever is leading the Conservative Party in that circumstance and that situation will then probably start using the exact same arguments. So I suppose it's a little bit tit for tat, but no matter what, it is clearly a massive problem that whoever is the government in England and Britain will have to face, and it doesn't seem to be going away anywhere anytime soon.
And just very quickly, Will, have you spoken to anybody there who actually takes a different view about this and says that, you know, they want to welcome these people?
Well, it's really interesting. Here on the outskirts of the Scampton camp, there's obviously a lot of concern. There was protests, for example, in Lincoln this weekend, where what you might describe as members of the far right came to Lincoln, and they faced off with groups that represent anti-racist groups. But quite interestingly, the way that the media reported that was that the anti-racist groups said that they don't think that the migrants should be coming here anyway. They don't think that this is the right plan. They have described it as inhumane. They've, in terms of describing these old airfields and these old bases, they say that they're like prisons and that people shouldn't be forced to stay in these sorts of places. So even with the people that would like to welcome asylum seekers into Britain, one of the arguments is that this isn't the right place for them. So I suppose that's one way that two opposing sides would agree on something that usually they're completely opposites on.
OK, Will Hollis outside RAF Scampton, thank you very much.
Let's update you. The very important new line coming in on the Public Pay Award and what the Prime Minister announced earlier. Of course, he did say that all the teaching unions had suspended their industrial action because of the pay deal that was suggested at 6.5%. John Glenn, the Treasury Minister, had told the Commons the pay award was fully funded, no new borrowing or spending to fund that deal. But we're now learning that the Department of Education has actually acknowledged it will have to, as they say, reprioritise existing budgets to pay for the rise, i.e. find cuts elsewhere of some £1.4 billion to actually fund the 6.5% pay rise offered to the teachers. This has been a sticking point, of course, but indications now that there will be cuts elsewhere to fund that deal. So clearly those teaching unions who have withdrawn their industrial action will have to maybe point that out to the unions as well as they vote on that pay offer. That is coming through.
Oscar-winning actor Kevin Spacey has taken to the witness box today, telling a jury that the sexual assault allegations against him are either madness, make no logical sense, or are a stab in the back.
Well, he's charged with a string of offences, alleged offences including indecent assault, sexual assault, causing a person to engage in sexual activity without consent. Jury hearing accounts from his 4 alleged victims yesterday. Well, he denies all those charges alleged to have been committed over a 12-year period.
Let's cross live to Theo Chikomba, who is outside Southwark Crown Court for us. You have been inside at this trial. What's the very latest, Theo?
Yes, well, this afternoon the trial resumed just after 2 p.m. and they've now moved on to allegations from yet another complainant, with the actor answering some questions about how they met. Now, this complainant worked in a pub and says that this is the situation that they met, and Kevin Spacey admitted in court this afternoon that he did make a pass at this person. After speaking to the alleged victim, he was told, "I'm not interested," to which Mr. Spacey went on to say that he respected and he wouldn't do that any further. And he said he misread some of the signals and went on to apologise. Now, on the night in question, he said that the people or the group he was with were young people. He said, "I love hanging out with a group of young people," saying it makes him feel young and he's interested in what they have to say and what's going on in their world. He said he's not sure how many people went back to his flat, but doesn't believe it was around 20 people, which is what has been reported, and he believes it's around 10 people. He said the night got rowdier. He then went on to ask people to leave and quieten down, and then subsequently to leave his flat. Now, there was a story published in a magazine several years ago, which Mr. Spacey says it said he was trying to attempt a sex act on the alleged victim. After that, his contracts disappeared and his work, he's been finding it hard to get work in the last couple of years. He did mention there's only a few production companies who have taken him on since then, but it has been difficult. His contracts and other things he was involved in have all sort of disappeared during that time. And he accused the online publication of not doing a thorough investigation when it came to this story. Now, Kevin Spacey denies 12 charges, including sexual assault. The trial is continuing here at Southwark Crown Court.
Theo, thank you very much indeed for updating us. Of course, more evidence from Southwark Crown Court as that defence continues. Thank you very much indeed. More reaction coming in to the government's announcement of the public sector pay deals, the independent pay review bodies. Now, a 7% offer for police, the highest of all the various public groups. But the Police Federation has already now reacted, falling short, it says, even though it is a step in the right direction.
Yeah, and we've also been hearing from the head of the Unite Union, Sharon Graham. She is saying, and bear in mind, the Unite Union is the UK's biggest union with members in both the public and private sectors, so it is huge. She says that by accepting the pay review body recommendations and then not funding them, the government is putting its departments between a rock and a hard place. They now have to choose between paying workers a half-decent salary or cutting services in already underfunded public services. So it does sound like, despite Mark, the Prime Minister's announcement saying that all this is very fair, there seems to be a lot of discontent.
Yeah, Police Federation representing 140,000 officers saying it's a step in the right direction, but we must not lose sight of the fact that the uplift fails to take into account a real-term cut of 17% that police have suffered since 2000. In addition, now the Department of Education has confirming that its pay deal for teachers, 6.5%, will have to be funded by existing budgets being cut or reprioritised, as they've said. That's £1.4 billion to help fund that pay rise. We did have the situation where John Glenn, the Treasury Secretary, was indicating that it was fully funded, no extra borrowing or tax, but now, of course, in the small print, indications that there have to be cuts elsewhere.
Yeah, and let's not forget the junior doctors who are on their first day of a 5-day strike. They have been offered a 6% rise. Is that going to be enough to stop their strikes over the next few days? And then after them, there are strikes by consultants as well.
Yeah, the spokesman for the consultants at least saying it's a PR stunt. So maybe not a round of applause from all those various sectors reacting to it, but of course we'll update you with all the reaction and all the latest news as well, still here on GB News with Patrick Christis for you next. Stay with us.
Thanks for your company.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Afternoon, I'm Alex Deakin, and this is your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. A wet and windy spell of weather is on the way, arriving tonight and lasting for much of tomorrow and into the weekend, courtesy of these two areas of low pressure, in particular this one, which is heading up towards the southwest. Now, ahead of that, many of us have had the driest day of a pretty showery week. There are still some heavy showers around across parts of eastern England and Scotland, and further outbreaks of mostly light rain pushing into Northern Ireland, North Wales and northwest England during this evening. But here comes a band of heavier rain accompanied by some strong and gusty winds, temperatures mostly holding up in the teens. Now, these winds will be pretty lively, particularly for this time of year. So it's going to be a blustery day over southwest England and Wales. There'll be heavy rain as well, exacerbated